The military dog stood behind reinforced steel, eyes burning with something that looked like rage but felt like grief. And while officers prepared to sign his execution order, a nurse nobody believed stepped forward and said 5 words that stopped everything. "You're executing the wrong soldier." At Riverside Veterans Medical Center in Thornfield, nobody saw Morgan Hayes coming. Not the administrators rushing to bury their mistakes, not the officers who thought they understood war, and definitely not the dog they'd already decided to kill. Before we begin, I need you to stay until the very end of this story. If you want to see justice served and witness what happens when the underestimated finally speak up, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. And let's dive in. Morgan Hayes looked like someone you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting her. At 32, she moved through the rehabilitation wing at Riverside Veterans Medical Center with the kind of steady, unremarkable competence that made people's eyes slide right past her. Average height, dark blonde hair pulled into a practical ponytail, scrubs that had seen too many shifts, the newest hire on a staff that had worked together for years. She'd been at Riverside for exactly 3 weeks when the situation with Axel started falling apart. The German Shepherd had arrived 6 days earlier from a forward operating base overseas, brought back after his handler, Staff Sergeant Liam Torres, died in a training accident that nobody wanted to discuss in detail. Axel had been Torres's partner for 4 years. 4 years of deployments nobody talked about, missions that didn't appear in official records, operations that left men changed and dogs trained to respond to commands most handlers had never heard. Now Torres was gone, and Axel had become something the facility's administrators didn't know how to handle. Morgan first heard about the dog during a staff meeting that felt more like a funeral. "The animal is unstable," Director Raymond Packard announced from the head of the conference table. He was 50-something, with silver hair that looked expensive and a voice that suggested he was used to being obeyed. "We've had 3 incidents in 4 days. Yesterday, he went after Hendricks when the kennel tech tried to move his food bowl. The man needed 8 stitches." Around the table, heads nodded. Morgan stayed quiet, watching. "We've consulted with behavioral specialists," Packard continued. "The consensus is clear. The dog sustained psychological trauma that makes him a liability. Euthanasia is the humane option." Morgan's hand tightened around her coffee cup. One of the senior nurses, a woman named Patricia Owens with 20 years at Riverside, spoke up carefully. "Has anyone checked his service records? Sometimes these military dogs are trained in specialized—" "We're not running a research project, Patricia." Packard's tone made it clear the discussion was over. "The decision's been made. We'll proceed Friday morning." Friday. 3 days away. Morgan looked down at the incident report scattered across the table. Even from her seat near the back, she could see the gaps in the documentation. Times that didn't line up. Descriptions that focused on outcomes but ignored context. The kind of paperwork people filled out when they needed to justify a decision they'd already made. After the meeting, she caught up with Patricia in the hallway. "Those incident reports," Morgan said quietly. "Did anyone actually observe the dog's behavior before the aggression started?" Patricia glanced around like she was checking for surveillance. "You're new. Probably better if you don't ask questions that make waves." "I'm just trying to understand what happened." "What happened is Packard wants this handled quickly and quietly." Patricia's voice dropped lower. "Torres wasn't supposed to die. There's going to be an investigation, and having his dog tear up staff members isn't the kind of publicity Riverside needs right now. Easier to say the animal was too traumatized to save." Morgan felt something cold settle in her chest. "So we're not trying to save him." "Honey, I've been doing this long enough to know when to recognize a losing battle." Patricia touched her arm, not unkindly. "That dog's already dead. They're just waiting for the paperwork to catch up." She walked away, leaving Morgan standing alone in the fluorescent-lit corridor. That night, Morgan did something she probably shouldn't have. She accessed the facility's kennel monitoring system from her apartment, using credentials that technically gave her view-only access to patient areas. The kennels were considered patient areas. Nobody had specifically said she couldn't look. She found Axel's enclosure on camera 3. The dog sat in the back corner of a concrete cell that looked more like a prison than a recovery space. Not lying down, not pacing, just sitting at attention, staring at the door with an intensity that made Morgan's breath catch. She watched for 20 minutes. The dog didn't move except to blink. He wasn't aggressive. He was waiting for someone who was never coming back. Morgan closed her laptop and stared at the dark screen for a long time, remembering things she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. A different facility, different uniforms, the weight of a rifle across her back, and the specific shade of red that dust turned in certain parts of Afghanistan when it mixed with blood. She'd left that version of herself behind when she came home, changed her career trajectory from combat medical support to civilian nursing, stopped mentioning the deployments, let people assume she'd spent her 20s in regular hospitals instead of field stations where the power went out during surgeries and mortars made the ground shake. It was easier that way. Easier to be overlooked than to carry the questions that came with being someone people remembered. But she recognized what she'd seen in Axel's posture, the rigid attention, the fixed stare, the refusal to stand down. He wasn't broken. He was still on mission, and nobody at Riverside understood the difference. The next morning, Morgan arrived early and went straight to the administrative wing. She found Raymond Packard in his office, reviewing what looked like budget reports. He glanced up with the expression of someone interrupted by something insignificant. "Ms. Hayes, what can I do for you?" "It's about the military dog, Axel." Packard's expression flattened. "That matter's been decided. I'd like permission to evaluate him before the euthanasia order is carried out." "You're a rehabilitation nurse, not a veterinary behaviorist?" "I have experience with combat trauma." Morgan kept her voice level. "I'd like 10 minutes to assess whether there are protocols we haven't tried." Packard set down his pen with deliberate precision. "Ms. Hayes, I appreciate your initiative, but you've been here less than a month. You're not familiar with how we handle these situations." "I'm familiar with how military working dogs are trained to respond under extreme stress. Sometimes what looks like aggression is actually—" "Let me be very clear." Packard leaned forward. "That animal has injured 3 staff members. Our liability insurance is already questioning our protocols. We've consulted experts, reviewed the literature, and made the responsible decision. What we don't need is a new hire with good intentions creating more problems." Morgan didn't move. "What if there's something in his training that's causing the behavior? Something we could de-escalate if we understood the commands he's responding to?" "Then the military should have sent documentation with the dog." Packard's tone made it obvious he considered the conversation over. "They didn't, which tells me Torres ran his own program, and whatever he taught that animal died with him. I'm sorry, but the decision stands." He went back to his budget reports. Morgan stood there for 3 seconds longer than was comfortable, then turned and left before she said something that would get her fired. She found Jake Rivera in the rehabilitation gym, helping a veteran with leg prosthetics work through resistance training. Jake was a former Army medic, one of the few staff members at Riverside who'd actually served. He'd been friendly since Morgan started, asking about her background without pushing when she kept her answers vague. She waited until he finished the session. "Can I ask you something?" Morgan said as the patient headed to the locker room. "Shoot. You heard about the dog they're putting down Friday?" Jake's expression shifted. "Axel. Yeah. Heard he's pretty messed up. You ever work with military dogs?" "Not directly. Saw them in action a few times. Those handlers are intense about their animals." He looked at her more carefully. "Why?" Morgan chose her words with precision. "I think something's wrong with how they're assessing him. The incident reports don't match what I'd expect from an animal that's genuinely dangerous. Packard says Packard's worried about liability and paperwork. I don't think anyone's actually tried to understand what the dog's responding to." Jake was quiet for a moment. "You thinking about doing something stupid?" "I'm thinking about doing my job." "Your job is post-surgical rehab for human patients." "My job is recognizing trauma." Morgan met his eyes. "And I'm telling you, that dog isn't attacking people because he's broken. He's following training nobody here knows how to read." Jake glanced toward the door, then back. "You tried talking to Packard?" "Just did. He shut me down in about 90 seconds. "So what are you going to do?" Morgan hadn't actually decided until she heard herself say it out loud. "I'm going to evaluate the dog myself. Tonight, after the kennel staff leaves." "Morgan, I need someone to come with me. Someone who knows how to document what we find properly." She paused. "Someone with service experience who will understand what we're looking at." Jake stared at her like he was trying to figure out whether she was brave or insane. "This could get us both fired." "Probably. Packard finds out, he'll make sure we don't work in veteran care again." "I know. And if that dog really is dangerous, he's not. Morgan said it with certainty she shouldn't have had. Trust me. Jake rubbed his face. Why do I feel like you're not telling me something? Because I'm not. Morgan kept her voice steady. But if I'm right, we're about to kill a decorated service animal because nobody bothered to do their job correctly. And if I'm wrong, you can tell Packard I forced you to come with me. That's not going to fly. Then tell him I lied about my credentials. Whatever you need to say. She held his gaze. But I'm going down there tonight, whether you come or not. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he swore under his breath. Midnight, after the overnight security sweep. And if that dog so much as growls wrong, we're out. Clear? Clear. He walked away shaking his head, and Morgan went back to her regular shift, trying not to think about all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. The hours dragged. She worked through patient check-ins, medication rounds, physical therapy documentation. Normal work that felt surreal when she knew what she was planning to do later. At 11:30, she changed into plain clothes and met Jake in the parking lot. They entered through the staff entrance using Morgan's badge. The facility was quiet, just overnight security and a skeleton crew of nurses on the patient floors. The kennels were in a separate building connected by an enclosed walkway, originally built for service dog training programs that had been defunded years ago. Jake had grabbed security access codes from a friend in facilities management. They moved through the darkened corridors without speaking, their footsteps echoing off concrete. The kennel area smelled like disinfectant and dog food. Fluorescent lights flickered on motion sensors as they entered. There were 12 enclosures, but only 3 were occupied. Axel and 2 therapy dogs used in patient recreation programs. Axel's enclosure was at the far end. Warning signs had been posted on the door. Dangerous animal. Do not approach. Authorized personnel only. Morgan could see him through the reinforced glass panel, still sitting in that same rigid posture, still staring at the door like Torres might walk through any second. Jake hung back. You sure about this? Morgan wasn't sure about anything, but she stepped forward anyway and opened the observation slot. The dog's head turned toward her. Even through thick glass, his eyes had weight. Hey, Axel, she said quietly. The dog didn't move. Morgan studied his posture, the way he held himself, the tension in his shoulders, the fixed forward stare. She'd seen it before. In soldiers who couldn't transition out of combat mode, men and women who came home but couldn't stop scanning for threats, couldn't relax their guard, couldn't accept that the mission was over. Axel wasn't being aggressive. He was standing post, waiting for relief that would never come. Morgan took a slow breath and did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She reached back into memories she'd carefully buried and pulled out pieces of a language most people had never heard. She spoke one word, low, clear, in a dialect used by specialized units in specific theaters of operation. A command that had nothing to do with standard military working dog protocols. Axel's entire body went still. Then slowly, his rigid posture softened. His head tilted slightly. His eyes lost that 1,000-yard stare and focused on her with something that looked like confusion. Jesus Christ, Jake whispered behind her. What did you just say? Morgan ignored him. She spoke another phrase, 3 words in the same dialect, using the cadence she'd heard handlers use in forward operating bases when they needed their dogs to transition from combat mode to stand down. Axel stood up, walked forward, pressed his nose against the glass where Morgan's hand rested on the other side. The transformation was so complete it didn't seem possible. Jake moved closer, staring. How did you... The overhead lights blazed to full brightness. Step away from that enclosure. Now. Morgan turned to find Raymond Packard standing in the doorway with 2 security officers. His face was rigid with fury. Both of you, out. Immediately. Jake raised his hands. Sir, we were just... You were violating direct facility protocols and accessing a dangerous animal without authorization. Packard's voice could have cut steel. Ms. Hayes, you were explicitly told to stay away from this situation. Morgan didn't move from the glass. Behind her, Axel made a soft sound. Not a growl, but something closer to a whine. He's not dangerous, Morgan said. He put a man in the emergency room 2 days ago. Because nobody knows how to communicate with him. Morgan turned to face Packard fully. He's trained in specialized commands that aren't part of standard military working dog protocols. His handler ran operations that used alternative communication systems, probably for covert work where standard commands could compromise security. Axel isn't attacking people, he's trying to follow his last orders, and when people interfere without using the right protocols, he interprets it as a threat. Packard stared at her. And how exactly would you know any of that, Ms. Hayes? Morgan felt the weight of the question. The way Jake was looking at her, the security officers paying attention now. She'd worked hard to be forgettable, to be someone nobody looked at twice. But Axel didn't have 3 more days for her to stay comfortable. Because I've worked with dogs like him before, Morgan said quietly. In facilities where the handlers were doing work that never made it into official records. I know what I'm looking at. Your employment file says you worked in civilian hospitals before coming here. My employment file says what I needed it to say to get a job where nobody asked questions. Morgan kept her voice level. But before that, I spent 18 months attached to medical support units working with special operations personnel in Afghanistan. I saw what these dogs can do, how they're trained, what happens when their handlers don't come home. And I'm telling you right now that if you kill Axel on Friday, you're not putting down a dangerous animal. You're executing a soldier who's still trying to complete his mission because nobody bothered to learn how to tell him the war is over. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of something that would either catch her or let her fall. Packard's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to track. You lied on your application. I omitted details that weren't relevant to the position. You have specialized military experience that you deliberately concealed. I have trauma experience that I chose not to advertise. Morgan didn't break eye contact. Because people treat you differently when they know. They either put you on a pedestal or assume you're damaged. I wanted to do my job without the weight of people's expectations. And now you're interfering in administrative decisions. I'm doing what I was trained to do, recognizing when someone's assessment is wrong because they don't have the full picture. Morgan gestured toward Axel. That dog has been defending his position for 6 days because nobody's given him stand-down authorization in a format he can recognize. The people he hurt weren't attacked. They were engaged as hostile contacts because they approached without proper identification protocols. Every incident in those reports happened because staff members treated him like a regular dog. Instead of a specialized asset operating under a command structure, none of you understand. One of the security officers shifted uncomfortably. Packard's face had gone from angry to something harder to read. Even if what you're saying is true, and that's a significant if, you still violated facility protocols and accessed a dangerous animal without authorization. That alone is grounds for immediate termination. Then fire me. Morgan's voice stayed steady. But before you do, let me show you that I'm right. Give me 20 minutes with that dog under controlled conditions. If I can't demonstrate that he's responding to specialized commands, I'll resign. But if I can prove he's not dangerous, if I can show you that every incident happened because of protocol failures and not animal instability, then you postpone that euthanasia order and bring in someone who actually understands how these programs work. You're not in a position to negotiate. I'm in the only position that matters right now. Morgan gestured toward the enclosure where Axel stood watching them with alert, focused eyes that no longer looked violent. I'm the only person in this building who knows how to reach him. You can fire me, blacklist me, do whatever you want to my career. But if you kill that dog without even trying to understand what he needs, you're not making a hard decision. You're taking the easy way out because it's less paperwork than admitting you mishandled a military asset. Jake made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh or a prayer. Packard stared at Morgan like he was seeing her for the first time. You're either incredibly brave or phenomenally stupid. Probably both. Morgan didn't smile. Do we have a deal? Before Packard could answer, one of the security officers spoke up. Sir, if she's right about the specialized training, that changes the liability profile significantly. If Torres' unit used non-standard protocols and we didn't verify before making the euthanasia decision, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Packard's jaw worked. 20 minutes. Tomorrow morning, 0800, with full security protocols and veterinary staff present. You get one chance to demonstrate what you're claiming. If you can't prove the dog is responding to specific commands, the euthanasia order proceeds as scheduled and you're terminated for cause. Understood? Understood. And Ms. Hayes? Packard's voice dropped. If you're wrong about this and someone gets hurt, I'll make sure every facility in the state knows why. Morgan nodded once. Packard turned and walked out. The security officers followed, leaving Morgan and Jake alone in the suddenly quiet kennel area. Jake let out a long breath. That was insane. Yeah. You really spent 18 months in Afghanistan? 22, actually. Morgan looked back at Axel, who'd settled into a more relaxed posture, watching her with what almost looked like trust. But who's counting? Why didn't you tell anyone? Same reason I didn't tell Packard until I had to. Morgan touched the glass between her and the dog one more time. Because once people know, you stop being yourself. You become the story they want to tell about you. Jake was quiet for a moment. What happens tomorrow if you can't make this work? Morgan thought about Axel sitting alone in this cell, waiting for a handler who would never return. Thought about Torres, whoever he'd been, trusting this dog with his life in places nobody would ever hear about. Thought about all the times she'd seen good soldiers discarded because the paperwork was easier than the work. Then I guess I'll need to find a new career. She turned away from the enclosure, but I'm not wrong about this. They walked back through the empty corridors toward the staff entrance. Behind them, Axel watched until they disappeared from sight, then lay down for the first time in 6 days, his head resting on his paws, his eyes finally closing. Not attacking, not defending, just waiting to see if the strange woman who spoke his language would come back and tell him what came next. Morgan didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with lukewarm coffee and a laptop, pulling up everything she could remember about specialized K9 protocols from units that didn't officially exist. The problem was that most of what she'd learned had never been written down. It lived in the muscle memory of handlers who'd worked in places where written records could get people killed. She had 20 minutes tomorrow morning to prove she understood a training system she'd only witnessed from the edges. At 600, her phone buzzed. Jake's name appeared on the screen. "You up?" he asked when she answered. Never went down. "Yeah, figured." He sounded tired. "Listen, word's already spreading. Half the staff knows about last night. Packard's assistant told someone in billing who told someone in physical therapy, and now everyone's talking about the nurse who lied about her background and broke into the kennels." Morgan closed her eyes. "How bad? People are divided. Some think you're crazy. Others think Packard's been looking for an excuse to flex authority, and you just gave him one." Jake paused. "A few are saying maybe you're onto something. But Morgan, if this goes wrong today..." "I know." "Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you just bet your entire career on being able to talk to a dog that's already hurt 3 people. 4, Morgan said quietly. "There was an incident the day before he arrived that didn't make it into the reports I saw. I checked the ER records last night. A transport officer got bit during the handoff from the military vehicle." Jake swore. "That makes it worse. Or it makes my point. Nobody used proper protocols during any of those encounters." Morgan stood up, carrying her coffee to the sink. "I'll see you at 0800. She hung up before he could argue. The drive to Riverside took 20 minutes through morning traffic. Morgan's hand stayed steady on the wheel, but her mind kept circling back to all the things that could go wrong. Axel could refuse to respond. She could misremember the commands. The dog could react aggressively, despite everything she believed about his behavior. She could be completely, catastrophically wrong. The parking lot was fuller than usual for a Thursday morning. Morgan recognized cars belonging to staff who normally didn't arrive until 9. They'd come early to watch. She grabbed her bag and headed inside, keeping her eyes forward, ignoring the stares that followed her through the corridors. Conversations stopped when she passed. People whispered. The rehabilitation wing felt hostile in a way it hadn't 3 weeks ago. Patricia Owens caught her near the nurses' station. "Morgan, wait." Morgan stopped. Patricia glanced around, then lowered her voice. "I heard what happened, what you told Packard about your background." "Yeah." "Why didn't you say something when you started? We could have used someone with combat medical experience. The veteran patient population would have..." "Because I didn't want to be the person with combat medical experience." Morgan kept her voice level. "I wanted to be a nurse who happened to have served, not a veteran who happened to know nursing. There's a difference." Patricia studied her face. "You really think you can help that dog?" "I know I can." "Packard's not a forgiving man. If you're wrong, then I'm wrong." Morgan adjusted her bag. "But at least I'll know I tried." Patricia nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I hope you're right." Morgan continued toward the kennel building. Jake was waiting outside the entrance with two veterinary techs she recognized from staff meetings. Both women looked nervous. "They're setting up now," Jake said. Packard brought in extra security. Also called in Dr. Reeves from the veterinary behavioral unit and some guy from risk management. Great. An audience. Morgan, I'm fine. She wasn't, but saying it out loud wouldn't help. Let's get this done. The kennel observation room had been transformed into something between a medical procedure and a tribunal. Packard stood near the back with a man in an expensive suit, risk management, probably, taking notes on a tablet. Dr. Reeves, a thin woman in her 50s with gray hair and skeptical eyes, waited near the enclosure with monitoring equipment. 4 security officers positioned themselves at strategic points. A video camera had been set up to record everything. Axel sat in his enclosure, watching through the glass. His posture was alert, but not aggressive. Morgan wondered if he'd slept at all after they'd left last night. Packard checked his watch. "It's 800, Ms. Hayes. You have 20 minutes to demonstrate your claims. Dr. Reeves will be observing for any signs of distress or aggressive behavior. Security will intervene immediately if the dog displays threat responses." He gestured toward the enclosure. "Proceed." Morgan set down her bag and approached the glass. Every eye in the room followed her. She studied Axel's posture, looking for signs of stress. His ears were forward, his tail neutral, his breathing even. He looked calm but focused, the same way soldiers looked during briefings when they were processing important information. "I need to enter the enclosure," Morgan said. Dr. Reeves frowned. "That's not advisable. We can conduct behavioral assessments through the barrier. I can't demonstrate communication protocols through glass." Morgan turned to Packard. "You want proof he's responding to specialized commands? I need to be in there with him." The risk management guy stepped forward. "Mr. Packard, I strongly advise against this. The liability exposure is already significant if we euthanize a military asset without proper cause." Packard's voice was flat. "Ms. Hayes, if that dog shows any aggression, security will use whatever force is necessary to extract you. Are we clear?" "Clear." One of the security officers unlocked the enclosure door. The mechanical sound of the bolt sliding back echoed through the observation room. Morgan stepped inside. The door closed behind her with a solid thunk that seemed too final. Axel stood up, his eyes locked on her. Morgan felt the weight of his attention, the focused intensity of an animal bred for combat work and trained to assess threats in seconds. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, letting him process her presence without adding pressure. Behind the glass, someone shifted nervously. Axel took 2 steps forward, close enough that Morgan could see the scars along his shoulder, old injuries that had healed rough, close enough to smell the kennel and stress on his coat. She slowly lowered herself into a crouch, making herself smaller, less threatening. It was a posture she'd learned from handlers who understood that dominance wasn't about standing tall, it was about control. "Hey, Axel," she said quietly, in English first. Normal words in a normal tone. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Then Morgan switched languages. Not literally, she was still using English words, but she changed the cadence, the pitch, the rhythm. She spoke the way handlers spoke when they were giving operational commands in the field. Short syllables, specific emphasis, a tonal pattern that bypassed normal dog training and went straight to specialized conditioning. She said, "Stand easy." Axel's entire body language shifted. The rigid alertness softened into something more relaxed. His tail dropped to a neutral position. His ears went from forward to a more restful angle. Behind the glass, Dr. Reeves leaned forward. Morgan spoke again, using another phrase from the specialized protocol. "Position report." Axel sat. Not the normal sit of a trained pet, but a specific posture. Spine straight, head up, eyes forward. It was the same position soldiers used when reporting to a superior officer. "Jesus," Jake whispered outside. Morgan stood slowly, maintaining eye contact. "You're waiting for someone who's not coming back." The dog watched her. "I know." Morgan's throat tightened. "I know you don't understand why he left. I know you're trying to hold the line until he returns. But Axel..." She used the cadence again, speaking words that probably didn't mean anything but carrying them in the rhythm that did. Your handler completed his mission. You completed yours. The watch is over. Axel's head tilted slightly, not understanding the words, but recognizing something in how they were delivered. Morgan reached into her pocket slowly, watching for any sign of tension. She pulled out a treat, standard training food she'd grabbed from the kennel supplies. She held it out. Axel didn't move. "Release protocol," Morgan said, using the specialized cadence. Not a command she'd heard often, but one that made sense if handlers needed to transition dogs from combat operations to stand down. "You're relieved." Axel stood, walked forward, took the treat gently from her hand. Then he did something that made Morgan's chest constrict. He leaned against her leg, the way dogs do when they're finally allowing themselves to trust. The way soldiers lean when the weight they've been carrying alone becomes too much. Morgan rested her hand on his head, feeling him tremble slightly under her palm. "Good boy," she said softly. "You did good." Behind the glass, the observation room had gone completely silent. Morgan looked up and met Packard's eyes. He's not dangerous. He was still on mission. Nobody told him to stand down in a format he could understand. Packard stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Dr. Reeves. "Your assessment." The veterinary behaviorist was reviewing footage on a tablet, replaying the interaction. The response pattern is consistent with learned behavior tied to specific auditory cues. The dog's stress markers decreased significantly after Ms. Hayes initiated her protocol sequence. She looked up. "This isn't standard military working dog training. This is something else. Something classified," the risk management officer said quietly, "which means we've been handling a specialized asset without proper documentation." Packard's expression suggested he was recalculating several things at once. "Ms. Hayes, exit the enclosure. Slowly." Morgan gave Axel one more quiet command. "Hold position," and moved toward the door. The dog stayed where he was, watching her go but not following, not protesting. The security officer let her out. The door locked behind her. Packard crossed his arms. "Where did you learn those protocols?" "Forward Operating Base Anaconda, 2019 through 2021. I was attached to medical support for units running operations that weren't in the regular rotation." Morgan chose her words carefully. "The handlers I worked with used specialized communication systems because standard commands could compromise operational security. What I just demonstrated is a fragment of what those dogs were trained to recognize." "And you didn't think to mention this when you applied here?" "I didn't think it was relevant to post-surgical rehabilitation nursing. Clearly it's relevant when we're dealing with military animals." "You weren't dealing with him," Morgan said. "You were putting him down without understanding what you were looking at." The tension in the room could have bent steel. Dr. Reeves cleared her throat. "Mr. Packard, if this dog is responding to specialized training from classified operations, we should contact the military unit that deployed him. They need to know their asset is here and what's happened." "Torres' unit has been contacted," Packard said. "They indicated the dog was being retired from service and transferred to our facility for evaluation. They didn't mention specialized training." "Because they probably can't," the risk management officer interjected. "If Torres was running operations with non-standard protocols, the training methods might still be classified. They're not going to discuss it with civilian facilities." Jake spoke up from near the door. "So what happens now?" "Good question." Morgan watched Packard's face, trying to read which direction he was leaning. The man had been ready to fire her 6 hours ago. Now he was standing in a room full of witnesses who just watched her prove that his euthanasia order had been premature. Packard was quiet for several seconds. Then he turned to the security team. "Continue monitoring the dog under standard protocols. No staff members enter the enclosure except Ms. Hayes until we determine next steps." He looked at Morgan. "My office. Now." They walked through the facility in silence, Morgan following 2 steps behind. Staff members watched them pass with undisguised curiosity. Word would spread faster now, the nurse who spoke secret languages to military dogs. The woman who'd been about to get fired and somehow didn't. Morgan felt exposed in a way she hadn't since coming home from Afghanistan. Packard's office had a view of the parking lot and walls covered with certifications and awards. He gestured to a chair. Morgan sat. He settled behind his desk, fingers steepled, expression unreadable. "You put me in a difficult position, Ms. Hayes." Morgan stayed quiet. "On one hand, you violated facility protocols, accessed a dangerous animal without authorization, and concealed relevant experience during your hiring process. Packard's tone was measured. On the other hand, you potentially prevented us from making a catastrophic mistake that would have exposed Riverside to significant legal liability if Torres' unit later revealed the dog's specialized status. I wasn't thinking about liability. No, you were thinking about saving the dog. Packard leaned back. Which is admirable, but doesn't change the fact that you went around proper channels. Proper channels were about to kill him in 2 days. Proper channels exist for a reason. So does moral obligation, Morgan said. Sir, Packard almost smiled. Almost. You have a problem with authority, Ms. Hayes. I have a problem with authority that stops listening before it has the full picture. And you think you always have the full picture? No. Morgan met his eyes. But I know what it looks like when someone's still fighting a war nobody else can see. And I wasn't going to watch Axel die because the paperwork was easier than the work. Packard was quiet for a moment. The military will send someone to evaluate the situation, probably within the next few days. Until then, you're responsible for Axel's care and transition protocols. You'll document everything, every command, every interaction, every behavioral observation. Dr. Reeves will supervise, but you're the primary handler. Morgan felt something loosen in her chest. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. If anything goes wrong, if that dog shows aggression, if your protocols fail, if we get any indication you misread the situation, you're still terminated. Understood? Understood. And Ms. Hayes, no more secrets. If there's anything else in your background that might become relevant, I need to know now. Morgan thought about the things she could tell him. The missions she'd supported, the casualties she'd treated, the night she'd held pressure on a handler's arterial bleed while his dog circled and whined, both of them knowing the medevac wouldn't arrive in time. Nothing that affects my work here, she said finally. Packard studied her face, then nodded. Dismissed. Morgan stood and walked out, her legs more unsteady than she wanted to admit. Jake was waiting in the hallway. You still employed? For now. That's better than I expected. He fell into step beside her. You know this is going to change everything, right? People are going to look at you differently. I know. Some are already saying you're a hero. Others think you manipulated the situation to make Packard look bad. Jake glanced at her. How you handling it? I'm not. Morgan pushed through the door to the rehabilitation wing. I did what needed doing. Everything else is noise. But the noise followed her through the rest of the day. Staff members she barely knew stopped her to ask questions. A physical therapist wanted to know if she'd really worked with special operations. A nurse from pediatrics asked if the rumors about classified missions were true. Morgan kept her answers short and kept moving. By 1500, she was exhausted from smiling politely and deflecting curiosity. She retreated to the kennels, where at least the expectations were clear. Axel watched her approach the enclosure. He stood when she entered, tail moving slightly. Not the frantic wagging of a normal dog, but a controlled acknowledgement. Hey, soldier, Morgan said quietly. She spent an hour working through basic protocols, documenting his responses, testing which commands he recognized and which ones had been specific to Torres. The dog was sharp, focused, responsive, nothing like the aggressive animal described in the incident reports. When she finally left the kennel, the sun was setting and her body felt like it had been through a deployment. She made it to her car before her phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? Ms. Hayes? Male voice, professional, with an edge that suggested military background. This is Captain Derek Matthews, United States Army, Special Operations Command. I understand you've been working with a military working dog named Axel. Morgan's grip tightened on the phone. That's correct? I'll be arriving at Riverside Veterans Medical Center tomorrow morning at 0900 to conduct an evaluation. I'd like to speak with you about the protocols you've been using. Of course. Ms. Hayes, I need to be clear about something. Matthews's tone shifted slightly. The training methods used with Axel are sensitive. I'll need to verify your background and clearance before we discuss specifics. I understand. Your service record indicates you were attached to combat support units in Afghanistan. Is that accurate? Yes, sir. And you're claiming familiarity with specialized K9 protocols? I'm claiming I witnessed them in action and recognized the behavioral patterns. Matthews was quiet for a moment. We'll discuss it tomorrow. Be prepared to answer detailed questions about how you acquired this knowledge. He hung up. Morgan sat in her car, watching the last light fade from the sky, and wondered what exactly she'd just set in motion. The next morning came too fast. Morgan arrived at 0830 to find a military vehicle already in the parking lot, black SUV with government plates and windows too dark to see through. Her stomach tightened. Inside, the administrative wing felt different, quieter. Staff members moved past quickly, avoiding eye contact. Jake caught her near the elevators. "The Army guy's already here. Showed up at 0800 with 2 other officers. They've been in Packard's office for half an hour." "They say anything?" "Not to me, but Morgan," he lowered his voice. "One of them has special operations insignia. This isn't just about the dog." Morgan nodded. She'd expected this. Once the military got involved, everything changed. She went to the kennels first, checking on Axel before whatever came next. The dog greeted her with that same controlled acknowledgement, and she spent 20 minutes running through protocols, grounding herself in something concrete. When she returned to the administrative wing, Packard's assistant was waiting. "They're ready for you." Morgan followed her to a conference room she'd never used before. Captain Matthews stood near the window, mid-40s, fit, with the kind of posture that came from years of command. 2 other officers flanked him, both watching her with expressions that gave away nothing. Packard sat at the head of the table, looking uncomfortable. Matthews extended his hand. "Ms. Hayes, thank you for meeting with us." Morgan shook his hand, military grip, assessing pressure. "Captain? Please, sit." She did. Matthews and his officers remained standing, a tactical choice that put them in positions of authority. "Ms. Hayes, I've reviewed the incident reports from this facility and watched the video from yesterday's demonstration." Matthews' tone was neutral, but his eyes were sharp. "I'd like you to walk me through exactly how you learned the protocols you used with Axel." Morgan chose her words carefully. "I was stationed at FOB Anaconda from 2019 to 2021, attached to medical support for combat operations. Some of the units I worked with used military working dogs trained for specialized operations. I observed handlers using communication methods that differed from standard training." "Observed," Matthews repeated. "You never received direct instruction in these methods?" "No, sir. Yet you were able to replicate complex command sequences that took handlers months to learn. I was able to recognize behavioral patterns and infer the appropriate responses." Morgan kept her voice steady. "I spent 2 years watching these dogs work. I learned by proximity." One of the other officers spoke up. "You're claiming you reverse-engineered classified training protocols through observation alone?" "I'm claiming I understood enough to recognize when a dog was still operating under specialized commands." Morgan met his eyes. "And that nobody at this facility was going to figure it out before they killed him." Matthews raised a hand, cutting off whatever the officer was about to say next. "Ms. Hayes, Staff Sergeant Liam Torres was part of a unit conducting operations that remain classified. The training methods he used with Axel are not part of standard military working dog programs. The fact that you were able to communicate with that dog raises questions about operational security." "I didn't compromise operational security. I saved a dog's life by demonstrating knowledge of protocols that officially don't exist." Matthews' voice was still neutral, but Morgan heard the warning underneath. "That creates a problem." The room went very quiet. Morgan felt the weight of what she'd walked into. She'd thought this was about Axel, but it was bigger than that. It was about secrets, about programs that lived in the shadows, about what happened when someone from the outside proved they could see things they weren't supposed to know existed. "What kind of problem?" she asked quietly. Matthews exchanged glances with the other officers. Some kind of silent communication passed between them. "The kind we need to discuss privately," Matthews said. "Mr. Packard, if you'll excuse us." Packard stood, looking between Morgan and the officers. "This is still my facility, and this is still a military matter involving classified operations." Matthews' tone left no room for argument. "We'll brief you on what you need to know." Packard left, and suddenly Morgan was alone with 3 special operations officers who were looking at her like she was a problem that needed solving. Matthews sat down across from her, his expression shifting into something harder. "Let's start over, Ms. Hayes, and this time, tell me everything you know about Operation Greylight." Morgan's blood went cold. She'd never heard that name before. But the way Matthews said it, the way the other officers watched her reaction, told her she'd just stumbled into something that went far deeper than one dog and one dead handler. Morgan's face must have shown something because Matthews leaned back slightly, recalculating. "You don't know what Operation Greylight is," he said. Not a question. "No, sir." One of the other officers, older, with a scar running through his left eyebrow, spoke up. "She's telling the truth. Look at her." Matthews studied Morgan for another few seconds, then nodded slowly. "All right, then we have a different problem." He gestured to the other officers. "Major Carver, Lieutenant Moss, we're going to explain something that doesn't leave this room. Are we clear, Ms. Hayes?" "Clear." Operation Greylight was a classified program running from 2018 to 2022 in 3 theater locations: Afghanistan, Syria, and one location I'm not authorized to name. Matthews pulled out a tablet and brought up what looked like mission reports with half the text redacted. The program trained specialized K-9 units for deep insertion operations where standard military presence would compromise objectives. These dogs worked with handlers using non-standard communication protocols specifically designed to be unrecognizable to enemy combatants or civilian observers. Morgan's stomach tightened. Torres was part of this. Torres ran one of 3 handler teams in Afghanistan. His dog, Axel, was trained in a protocol variant that combined verbal commands with tonal patterns and physical cues. It was effective. It was also supposed to be completely secure. Matthews looked at her directly. "You're the first person outside the program to demonstrate functional knowledge of these methods." "I didn't know what I was doing had a name. I just recognized what I'd seen before." "Where exactly did you see it?" Major Carver asked. The scar made his expression harder to read. "FOB Anaconda is a large installation. Greylight operations didn't run through standard channels. I was attached to a forward surgical team that supported various units. We didn't ask questions about where casualties came from or what they'd been doing. We just patched them up and moved on." Morgan chose her words with precision. "But sometimes handlers came through with their dogs. Sometimes those dogs behaved differently than standard military working dogs. And sometimes I paid attention when I probably should have stayed focused on my own job." Lieutenant Moss, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. "What did you observe?" "Communication patterns that didn't match any training manual I'd read. Dogs responding to commands that sounded like normal English, but had something else layered underneath. Handlers who could give orders in the middle of combat noise and have their dogs execute complex behaviors without hesitation." Morgan paused. "I noticed because I spent a lot of time around traumatized soldiers. I learned to recognize when someone was using specialized training to maintain control under extreme stress." Matthews exchanged another look with his officers. More silent communication that Morgan wasn't part of. "Ms. Hayes, the reason we're having this conversation is because Axel's handler died under circumstances that are currently under investigation." Matthews' voice dropped. "Torres's death was officially ruled an accident during a training exercise. But there are inconsistencies in the incident report that suggest something else happened." Morgan felt cold spread through her chest. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "The kind that make us question whether Torres's death was actually accidental." Major Carver pulled up another document on the tablet. "He died from a fall during a climbing drill, but the equipment failure that caused the fall doesn't match the maintenance records. The gear had been inspected 2 days prior and certified as operational." "You think someone tampered with it?" "We think it's possible." Matthews leaned forward. "And if someone did, we need to know why. Which brings us to Axel." Morgan saw where this was going. "You think the dog knows something?" "We think the dog was there when Torres died. Military working dogs don't just observe, they record behavioral patterns, environmental cues, threat assessments. If something happened to Torres that wasn't accidental, Axel might have reacted to it in ways that would tell us what we're looking for." "You want me to work with him?" Morgan said slowly. "Not just to rehabilitate him. You want me to help you investigate Torres's death. We want you to continue doing what you started." Matthews straightened. "But we need you to document everything. Every command that triggers a response. Every behavioral pattern that seems connected to Torres. Every detail that might help us understand what that dog experienced in the hours before his handler died." Lieutenant Moss added, "Ms. Hayes, if Torres was killed deliberately, whoever did it is still out there. And if they knew about Greylight protocols, they might have left evidence that only someone who understands those protocols could recognize. Morgan looked at the three officers, reading the tension underneath their professional facades. This wasn't just about one handler's death. This was about operational security, about classified programs, about the possibility that someone inside the military had committed murder and gotten away with it because the people investigating didn't know the right questions to ask. "What happens if I say no?" she asked. "Then we take Axel back to military custody and you return to your regular duties." Matthew's tone made it clear that wasn't the answer he wanted. "But, Ms. Hayes, you've already proven you can reach that dog in ways our current handlers can't. If there's information locked in his training responses, information that could tell us what really happened to Torres, you're the best chance we have of accessing it." Morgan thought about Axel sitting in that kennel, still waiting for orders that would never come. Thought about Torres, whoever he'd been, trusting his life to that dog in operations nobody would ever hear about. Thought about the weight of carrying secrets that could get people killed if they surfaced in the wrong way. "I'll need complete access to Axel's service records," she said. "Everything Torres documented about his training, mission logs, behavioral assessments, any notes about protocol modifications. Some of that information is still classified. Then declassify what I need or find someone else." Morgan kept her voice level. "I'm not going into this blind. If you want me to help investigate Torres's death through his dog's behavior, I need to understand the full scope of what that dog was trained to do." Matthews looked at Major Carver, who nodded slightly. "We can provide redacted versions of the relevant documents," Matthews said. "But Ms. Hayes, everything you see, everything you learn, everything we discuss, it stays contained. You sign a non-disclosure agreement, you submit to security protocols, and you understand that violating operational security will result in federal prosecution. Are we clear?" "Clear. Then we have an agreement." Matthews stood and the other officers followed. "We'll have the paperwork ready by this afternoon. In the meantime, continue your work with Axel. Document everything, but don't discuss this conversation with anyone. That includes your supervisor and your colleagues." "What do I tell Packard?" "Tell him the military is conducting a routine evaluation, and you've been temporarily assigned to assist. He doesn't need details." Matthews moved toward the door, then paused. "Ms. Hayes, one more thing. If you discover something in Axel's behavioral patterns that suggests Torres's death wasn't accidental, you come to us immediately. You don't investigate on your own. You don't share your findings with anyone else. Understood?" "Understood." The officers left, and Morgan sat alone in the conference room, feeling like she'd just agreed to something that was going to change her life in ways she couldn't predict. She spent the next hour in the kennels, working with Axel while her mind processed what Matthews had told her. The dog responded to her commands with precision, but now she was looking for different things. Stress patterns, trauma responses, behavioral signatures that might indicate what he'd witnessed. Axel's ears went back when she used certain tonal variations. His posture shifted when she combined specific hand signals with verbal commands. And once, when she accidentally dropped a metal food bowl and it clanged against the concrete floor, the dog's entire body locked up for 3 seconds before he forced himself to relax. Startle response, consistent with exposure to sudden loud noises associated with trauma. Morgan documented everything. Jake found her during lunch carrying 2 sandwiches from the cafeteria. "You've been down here for 4 hours. Figured you might be hungry." Morgan accepted the sandwich. "Thanks." "So," Jake sat on a supply crate, unwrapping his food. "Military's taking over?" "Something like that." "You allowed to talk about it?" "Not really." Jake nodded, chewing. "Fair enough. For what it's worth, people are starting to come around. The nurses who thought you were crazy yesterday are saying maybe you knew what you were doing. Even Patricia admitted she was wrong about writing the dog off." "That's good." "Packard's still pissed, though. He's not used to being outmaneuvered, and you made him look bad in front of his staff." Jake watched her face. "You okay? You seem different." Morgan took a bite of sandwich she didn't taste. "Just processing." "Processing what?" "Everything." She set the sandwich down. "Jake, if someone asked you to get involved in something complicated, something that could go wrong in ways you couldn't predict, would you do it?" "Depends. Is it the right thing?" "I think so, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for it." Jake was quiet for a moment. "Morgan, I watched you walk into that enclosure yesterday with a dog everyone said would kill you. You didn't hesitate. You knew what you were doing, and you did it anyway because it needed to be done." He stood up. "Whatever the military asked you to do, I'm guessing it's the same kind of situation. And I'm guessing you've already decided to do it. You're just second-guessing yourself now." He left before she could respond. Morgan finished her sandwich alone, watching Axel sleep in the corner of his enclosure, and wondered if Jake was right. The paperwork arrived at 1500, 20 pages of legal language that basically said Morgan agreed to keep her mouth shut or go to prison. She signed without reading all of it because she'd already made her decision. An hour later, a secure tablet was delivered to her by Lieutenant Moss. "Torres' service records," he said. "Redacted, but you'll have what you need. The tablet's encrypted. Don't try to copy anything off it. Don't photograph the screen, and don't leave it unattended." "Got it." Morgan spent the evening in the facility's small break room, reading through Torres' documentation. The files painted a picture of a handler who'd been exceptional at his job but difficult to manage. Multiple commendations for operational excellence, also multiple disciplinary notes for refusing to follow standard protocols when he thought his methods were better. Torres had modified Axel's training extensively, layering his own innovations onto the base Greylight program. He'd developed hand signals that combined with voice commands in ways that let him communicate complex instructions under combat conditions. He'd trained Axel to recognize threat patterns that went beyond standard security work. And according to one incident report from 6 months before his death, Torres had filed a complaint about another handler in the program, someone he claimed was using dogs in ways that violated operational ethics. The complaint had been investigated and dismissed. The other handler's name was redacted. Morgan made notes on a separate pad, documenting patterns she saw between Torres' training modifications and Axel's current behavioral responses. The dog was still operating under some of Torres' customized protocols, still trying to execute commands his handler had given him in those final days. She worked until midnight, then drove home, slept 4 hours, and returned to the facility before dawn. Axel greeted her with that same controlled acknowledgement, and Morgan began the careful work of testing specific command sequences, watching for reactions that might tell her what the dog had experienced. On the third day, she found something. She'd been working through a series of hand signals Torres had used for threat assessment, combinations of finger positions and arm movements that told the dog to evaluate and categorize potential dangers. Most of them Axel responded to normally. But one specific sequence, 3 fingers raised, arm horizontal, followed by a closed fist dropped to waist level, triggered a reaction that made Morgan's breath catch. Axel's entire posture changed. His ears went flat. His lips pulled back slightly, not in aggression, but in what looked like distress. He backed away from her, whining low in his chest. Morgan froze, holding perfectly still. The dog was staring at her hand like it represented something terrible. She slowly lowered her arm and shifted into a neutral stance. Axel's tension eased, but didn't disappear completely. Morgan checked Torres' notes on the tablet. The hand signal was documented as Threat Assessment Level 5, the highest category, reserved for immediate lethal danger. Torres had used that signal right before he died. Morgan called Matthews from the secure phone he'd given her. He arrived within an hour, bringing Major Carver. They watched through the observation glass as Morgan replicated the hand signal sequence. Axel had the same reaction: distress, withdrawal, fixation on the hand position. "That signal means extreme threat," Matthews said quietly. "Torres would only use it in situations where lethal force was imminent." "He used it right before he died," Morgan said. "Axel's associating it with whatever happened to Torres." Major Carver pulled out his own tablet, reviewing what looked like investigative files. The accident report said Torres fell during a solo climbing drill, but if he was signaling Level 5 threat assessment, he wasn't alone. "Someone else was there," Matthews said. "Someone he recognized as dangerous enough to signal his dog." Morgan watched Axel slowly settle back into a more relaxed posture. "Can you access the incident location? See if there's physical evidence that got overlooked?" "The scene was processed 3 months ago. Anything useful is long gone." Matthews turned to face her. "But Ms. Hayes, if Torres signaled a threat right before he died, Axel might have additional behavioral patterns tied to whoever he was signaling about. Can you test for recognition responses?" Morgan understood what he was asking. "You want me to see if Axel reacts to specific people?" We have a short list of personnel who were at the training facility when Torres died. If we bring them in for routine evaluations and you observe Axel's reactions, you want to use the dog as a witness identification. I want to use every tool available to find out if one of our own killed a decorated handler. Matthew's voice was flat. Can you do it? Morgan looked at Axel through the glass. The dog had finally relaxed completely, lying down with his head on his paws. He looked tired. He looked like he'd been carrying weight nobody else could see. I can try, she said. But Matthews, if we're right about this, if someone in the military killed Torres and Axel identifies them, what happens next? Then we have enough evidence to open a formal investigation, and whoever did this faces a court-martial. And if we're wrong, if Axel's reactions are just trauma responses that don't actually indicate anything, then we're back where we started. Matthews met her eyes. But I don't think we're wrong, and I don't think you do either. He was right. Morgan had seen enough combat trauma to recognize the difference between general stress and specific association. Axel wasn't just traumatized. He was carrying the memory of something that had happened to someone he'd trusted with his life. The evaluation started the next day. Matthews brought in 8 personnel who'd been at the training facility when Torres died. Other handlers, support staff, administrative officers. Each one came through for what was officially described as a routine post-incident consultation. Morgan positioned herself in the kennel area where she could observe Axel's reactions when each person passed by the observation window. The first 3 triggered no response. Axel glanced at them and went back to resting. The 4th person, a supply sergeant named Williams, got a mild alert. Axel stood up, watching until the man left, consistent with recognition but not threat response. The 5th person was a handler named Marcus Petty, 30-something, fit, with the kind of confidence that came from years of successful operations. Axel saw him through the window, and everything changed. The dog's entire body went rigid. His ears flattened completely. His lips pulled back and a sound came out of his chest that Morgan had never heard before. Not a growl, not a bark, but something that sounded like fury compressed into low frequency. Petty stopped walking, staring at the dog. What's wrong with him? Morgan kept her voice neutral. He's having a stress response. It happens sometimes with rescue animals. I worked with Torres. The dog knows me. That might be part of it. Morgan watched Axel, documenting every micro-expression. Sometimes familiar people trigger stronger reactions in traumatized animals. Petty looked at Axel for another few seconds, his expression unreadable, then continued down the hallway. Axel tracked him until he disappeared from sight, trembling with tension that didn't ease even after Petty was gone. Morgan immediately called Matthews. He arrived 15 minutes later with Major Carver and Lieutenant Moss. They reviewed the security footage of Axel's reaction 3 times. That's not trauma, Major Carver said flatly. That's targeted aggression. Matthews pulled up Petty's service record on his tablet. Marcus Petty, 10 years in K-9 operations, multiple deployments, exemplary record. He was one of the handlers Torres filed that ethics complaint about. Morgan felt pieces clicking together. Torres thought Petty was misusing his dog. The complaint said Petty was pushing his animal beyond safe operational limits, using aggression training methods that violated program guidelines. Matthews scrolled through the file. Torres reported it to program oversight. They investigated, found insufficient evidence, and dismissed the complaint. Torres appealed the decision twice. Both appeals were denied. 3 months later, Torres died, Lieutenant Moss said quietly. The room went silent. We need more than a dog's reaction, Major Carver said finally. Defense attorneys would tear that apart in court. We need physical evidence, witness testimony, something concrete that connects Petty to Torres's death. Matthews was already pulling up additional files. Petty was at the training facility the day Torres died. He signed out equipment from the gear room that morning, climbing rope, carabiners, harnesses, standard training supplies. Morgan leaned forward. What time did he sign it out? Oh, 6:30. What time did Torres's accident occur? The incident report says approximately 0900. Matthew's expression shifted, but the gear room logs show Petty returned his equipment at 0845, 15 minutes before Torres fell. Major Carver straightened. He returned gear 15 minutes before an accident that was caused by gear failure. Could be coincidence, Lieutenant Moss said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. Morgan thought about the hand signal Torres had used, the Level 5 threat assessment. Matthews, if Torres knew Petty was there, if he recognized him as the threat, he would have signaled Axel before Petty could stop him. It would have been instinct. Which means Axel saw everything, Matthews said. He saw Torres' signal. He saw what happened next. And he's been carrying that memory for 3 months, waiting for someone to understand what he was trying to tell them. Morgan looked at the security footage still frozen on the screen, showing Axel's rigid posture, his flattened ears, his focused aggression. What do we do now? Matthews closed his tablet. Now we build a case. Major Carver, pull every piece of documentation on Torres' accident, equipment logs, witness statements, maintenance records, everything. Lieutenant Moss, I want a full background on Petty, financials, communications, anyone he was close to. Ms. Hayes, he turned to her. I need you to document everything Axel does, every behavioral response, every stress pattern, every indication that he's reacting to specific memories. It won't be enough for court-martial on its own, but combined with physical evidence, it might give us what we need. How long will this take? Morgan asked. As long as it takes? Matthew's voice was hard. Someone killed one of our own and made it look like an accident. I'm not letting that stand. The investigation moved fast after that. Major Carver found inconsistencies in the equipment maintenance logs, entries that had been altered after Torres' death, signatures that didn't match the duty roster. Someone had tried to cover their tracks, but they'd done it sloppily. Lieutenant Moss discovered that Petty had been passed over for a promotion 2 weeks before Torres' death, a promotion that went to Torres instead. The recommendation letter specifically cited Torres' superior handling protocols and ethical standards. And Morgan documented everything Axel did, building a profile of a dog who'd witnessed his handler's murder and been unable to tell anyone because nobody spoke his language. On the 6th day, Matthews got a break. A witness came forward, another handler who'd been at the training facility the morning Torres died. She hadn't reported what she'd seen because she didn't think it mattered, but after hearing about the investigation, she contacted Major Carver. She'd seen Petty near the climbing area at 08:30, alone, carrying equipment, 15 minutes before Torres arrived. Matthews moved immediately. Military police arrested Petty during a routine training session, taking him into custody without explanation. They executed a search warrant on his quarters and found something that made Morgan's blood run cold when Matthews told her about it. A climbing carabiner in Petty's footlocker. Damaged. With scratches consistent with deliberate tampering. The kind of damage that would cause equipment to fail under stress. The kind of failure that would look like an accident if nobody examined the evidence too closely. Petty denied everything during initial questioning, but when confronted with the physical evidence, the witness testimony, and the gear room logs, his story started falling apart. He'd been angry about the promotion, angry about Torres' ethics complaint, angry that someone he saw as self-righteous and difficult was being rewarded while he was overlooked. He'd tampered with Torres' climbing gear and watched from a distance as the handler fell. And he'd thought nobody would ever know because the dog couldn't talk. Matthews called Morgan into a secure briefing room 2 days after the arrest. Major Carver and Lieutenant Moss were there, along with 2 officers Morgan didn't recognize, JAG attorneys probably, preparing for prosecution. Petty's confessed, Matthews said without preamble. Full statement. He admitted to tampering with Torres' equipment with intent to cause fatal injury. He'll face court-martial for premeditated murder. Morgan felt something release in her chest. What about Axel? That's why you're here, Matthews gestured to one of the JAG officers. Ms. Hayes, Axel's behavioral responses and your documentation are going to be part of the evidence package. Not as primary proof, we have physical evidence for that, but as corroborating testimony showing the dog witnessed the crime and identified the perpetrator. It strengthens the case significantly. The dog's a witness, Morgan said slowly. The dog's the reason we knew where to look. Matthew's expression softened slightly. Ms. Hayes, without your work, Petty would have gotten away with this. Torres would have been just another training accident, and Axel would have been euthanized as a dangerous animal, taking everything he knew to his grave. Morgan thought about how close they'd come to exactly that outcome. 2 more days and Axel would have been dead, his testimony lost forever. "What happens to him now?" she asked. "That's up to you." Matthews pulled out paperwork. "The military is formally retiring Axel from service. He's earned it, but he needs a placement, someone who understands his training, who can help him transition to civilian life, who won't ask him to forget what he's been through, but will give him space to heal." Matthews set the papers in front of her. "We'd like that person to be you." Morgan stared at the documents. Adoption papers. Transfer of custody from military service to civilian ownership. "I work full-time," she said. "I live in a small apartment. I've never had a dog before." "You saved his life twice," Lieutenant Moss said. "Once when you stopped the euthanasia, and once when you made sure his handler's death wasn't forgotten. That dog trusts you, and from what we've seen, you understand him better than anyone else could." Morgan looked at the papers, at her name already filled in on the adopter line, and made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. She signed. The news broke 3 days later, not publicly, because Special Operations didn't discuss their failures in the open, but through military channels that reached Riverside fast enough. Handler arrested for murder of fellow service member. Military working dog instrumental in investigation. Nurse at civilian facility credited with breakthrough. Packard called Morgan into his office that afternoon. He looked tired. "The military sent me a formal commendation letter about your work," he said. "They're recommending you for recognition at the National Veteran Services level." Morgan didn't know what to say to that. "I also received a call from the Inspector General's office," Packard continued. "They're investigating how this facility handled Axel's case. Specifically, they're questioning why we moved forward with euthanasia without proper verification of his specialized status." "Sir, I made a mistake, Ms. Hayes." Packard's voice was flat. "I prioritized administrative convenience over due diligence. I let liability concerns override proper evaluation protocols. And I nearly killed a military asset who was carrying evidence of a murder because I didn't want to deal with the paperwork." He met her eyes. "You were right to challenge my decision. You were right to go around proper channels when those channels were failing. And I'm sorry it took this long for me to say it." Morgan had expected a lot of things. An apology wasn't one of them. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You're being reassigned," Packard said. "The military is requesting you as a consultant for veteran K-9 transition programs. They want you to develop protocols for identifying and rehabilitating military working dogs with specialized training. It's a 6-month contract, full funding, based out of Riverside, but with travel to other facilities." Morgan's mind raced. "I don't have credentials for that kind of work." "You have something better. Experience that matters." Packard slid a folder across his desk. "This is your new job description. Read it, think about it, and let me know by tomorrow. But Ms. Hayes," he paused, "you changed how we do things here. You made us better. Don't waste that." Morgan took the folder and left, her head spinning. She went to the kennels, where Axel was waiting. The dog stood when she entered, tail moving in that controlled acknowledgement that was becoming familiar. "Hey, soldier," Morgan said. "Want to hear something crazy?" Axel tilted his head, and for the first time since Morgan had met him, she saw something in his expression that looked like peace. The adoption became official the following week. Morgan brought Axel home to her apartment, set up a bed in the corner, and watched him explore his new space with cautious curiosity. He didn't sleep that first night, just sat by the door, alert, waiting. But on the second night, he lay down. And on the third night, he slept. Morgan started her new position 2 weeks later, traveling to facilities across 3 states, teaching staff how to recognize specialized training patterns in military working dogs, how to identify trauma versus aggression, how to communicate with animals who'd been trained in languages most people didn't know existed. Jake texted her regularly with updates from Riverside. Patricia Owens had taken over Morgan's old rehabilitation cases and was doing well. The facility had implemented new evaluation protocols for all incoming military animals. Packard had hired 2 additional staff members with veteran service backgrounds. Things were changing. Morgan was conducting an evaluation at a facility in Colorado when her phone rang. Unknown number. "Ms. Hayes?" Male voice, unfamiliar. "This is Colonel Vincent Shaw, U.S. Army Special Operations Command. I'm calling about a sensitive matter regarding your security clearance." Morgan's grip tightened on the phone. My clearance was processed through Captain Matthews's investigation. That was temporary authorization for a specific case. I'm calling about something else. Shaw's tone was carefully neutral. Ms. Hayes, your work with Axel in the Torres investigation demonstrated capabilities we didn't know existed outside military channels. We'd like to discuss a more permanent arrangement. What kind of arrangement? The kind where you help us with other cases. Other dogs? Other situations where specialized knowledge might be the difference between justice and cover-up. Shaw paused. We're offering you a formal position as a civilian contractor with Special Operations K-9 programs, full clearance, competitive pay, and access to cases that need someone who can see what others miss. Morgan looked across the evaluation room where a German shepherd watched her with alert, assessing eyes. Another dog with a story nobody had bothered to read correctly. Another soldier waiting for someone to understand what he'd survived. I'll need operational independence, she said. I won't work for people who prioritize paperwork over doing the right thing. Noted and accepted. Shaw's tone shifted to something that sounded like respect. Ms. Hayes, we need people like you. People who'll challenge the system when the system's wrong. People who'll fight for soldiers who can't fight for themselves. He paused. What do you say? Morgan thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The deployments she'd tried to forget. The skills she'd thought she'd left behind. The quiet nurse nobody noticed until she proved them all wrong. Send me the paperwork, she said. I'll review it. She hung up and went back to work, Axel waiting patiently by her side. And behind them both, the shadow of Raymond Packard's catastrophic mistake that almost buried the truth forever. The paperwork arrived by courier 2 days later. 63 pages of security clearances, non-disclosure agreements, and operational parameters that spelled out exactly how much of Morgan's life was about to change. She read every word twice before signing, then sent it back and waited for the world to catch up with what she'd agreed to. Word traveled faster than she expected. By the time Morgan returned to Riverside for her final administrative transition, the facility felt different. Staff members who'd once barely acknowledged her now stopped to shake her hand. Veterans in the rehabilitation wing asked if the rumors were true. Was she really working with Special Operations now? Patricia Owens cornered her in the break room with coffee and questions. You're leaving us, Patricia said. Not quite an accusation, but close. I'm transitioning to contract work. I'll still consult here when needed. But you're not coming back full-time. Morgan stirred her coffee, watching the liquid swirl. I can do more good working with dogs across multiple facilities than I can staying in one place. Patricia was quiet for a moment. You know, Packard's been different since this whole thing went down. Quieter, less sure of himself. He should be. He's also been asking HR about veterans with specialized medical backgrounds. I think he's trying to make changes. Patricia set down her cup. You scared him, Morgan, made him realize how close he came to doing something unforgivable. Good. Maybe next time he'll listen before he decides someone's disposable. Maybe. Patricia's expression shifted. For what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't back down. Even when I told you it was a losing battle, you proved me wrong. Morgan met her eyes. You weren't wrong about it being a battle. You were just wrong about it being unwinnable. Patricia left, and Morgan finished her coffee alone, thinking about all the battles people decided weren't worth fighting because the cost seemed too high. That afternoon, she had a final meeting with Packard to sign off on her transition paperwork. His office looked the same, but he didn't. The confident authority he'd worn like armor had cracked, revealing something more uncertain underneath. Your new contract starts next week, he said, sliding documents across the desk. You'll maintain consultant status with Riverside, but your primary work will be through military channels. Yes, sir. Packard leaned back, studying her. I spoke with Colonel Shaw yesterday. He thinks very highly of your capabilities. Morgan said nothing. He also mentioned that you negotiated operational independence into your contract, that you won't work cases where administrative convenience overrides proper protocols. Packard's mouth twitched. I assume that clause was inspired by your experience here. It was inspired by not wanting to repeat mistakes that almost got a decorated military asset killed. Point taken. Packard was quiet for a moment. Ms. Hayes, I've spent considerable time reflecting on my decisions regarding Axel. The Inspector General's investigation made that reflection mandatory, But the conclusions I reached were my own. He paused. I prioritized institutional reputation over individual welfare. I made assumptions based on incomplete information and refused to hear challenges to those assumptions. Those failures nearly resulted in an irreversible injustice. Morgan waited. I'm implementing policy changes, Packard continued. New evaluation protocols for all incoming military animals. Mandatory consultation periods before any euthanasia decisions. Third-party review processes for cases involving specialized training. He met her eyes. I'm also establishing a liaison position specifically for veteran service animals. Someone with military experience who can identify situations where standard protocols aren't adequate. That's a good start. It shouldn't have taken your intervention to make these changes necessary. Packard's voice was measured. But since it did, I want to ensure nothing like this happens again at any facility I oversee. Morgan signed the final document and stood. Sir, the changes you're making matter. But what matters more is why you're making them. If it's just to protect yourself from future investigations, they won't stick. If it's because you actually understand what almost happened here, what you almost did, then maybe they will. Packard didn't respond, and Morgan left his office for the last time, carrying her box of personal belongings and a dog who'd survived everything the world had thrown at him. The real fallout from Torres's murder investigation hit 3 weeks later. Morgan was at a facility in Maryland, evaluating a Malinois with severe handler attachment issues, when Matthews called. Petty's court-martial is moving forward, he said without preamble. Prosecution's building a strong case. But there's a complication. Morgan's stomach tightened. What kind of complication? During pretrial discovery, Petty's defense attorney filed motions questioning the legitimacy of using Axel's behavioral responses as corroborating evidence. They're arguing it's junk science, that dog behavior isn't reliable testimony, that the entire line of investigation was based on unverified assumptions. We had physical evidence. The damaged carabiner, the gear logs, the witness, and the defense is claiming all of that was discovered only after we used Axel's reactions to target Petty specifically. They're saying we conducted an unlawful search based on inadmissible evidence. Matthew's voice was tight with frustration. Morgan, they're trying to get the entire case thrown out on procedural grounds. Morgan looked across the evaluation room where the Malinois watched her with wary eyes. What do you need from me? Testimony. Expert witness statement explaining the scientific basis for behavioral analysis in military working dogs. The prosecution needs to establish that Axel's responses were legitimate indicators of recognition and threat association, not random stress reactions we interpreted to fit our theory. When? Preliminary hearing is in 2 weeks. Can you prepare documentation supporting your methodology? Morgan thought about the months she'd spent documenting Axel's behavioral patterns, the careful observations, the cross-reference training protocols. I can prepare it, but Matthews, I'm not a veterinary behaviorist. I'm a nurse with field experience. A defense attorney is going to tear apart my credentials. Then we make sure your experience speaks louder than your credentials. Matthews paused. Morgan, Petty's attorney is going to come at you hard. They'll question your background, your motives, your relationship with the dog. They'll try to make it look like you manipulated evidence to support a predetermined conclusion. Are you prepared for that? Are you asking if I'm sure about what I documented? I'm asking if you're ready to defend it under hostile cross-examination. Morgan watched the Malinois finally relax enough to lie down, still watching her, but no longer seeing her as a threat. She thought about Axel, about Torres, about all the soldiers, human and canine, who'd been failed by systems that prioritize convenience over truth. I'm ready, she said. The next 2 weeks were brutal. Morgan compiled every piece of documentation she had on Axel's behavioral responses, cross-referenced them with Torres's training notes, and built a presentation that laid out exactly how she'd identified the patterns that led to Petty. She consulted with Dr. Reeves, who'd observed the original demonstrations, and with 2 veterinary behaviorists who specialized in military working dogs. She rehearsed her testimony until she could recite behavioral markers in her sleep, and she tried not to think about what would happen if Petty walked free because her testimony wasn't strong enough. Jake called her the night before the hearing. You good? Define good. Are you going to fold under pressure? No. Then you're good. Jake's tone shifted slightly. Morgan, half the veteran community is following this case, not publicly, but through the networks. People are watching to see if the military actually holds one of its own accountable for killing a handler. Your testimony matters. No pressure then. You've handled worse. Jake paused. How's Axel? Morgan looked across her hotel room where the dog slept peacefully for the first time in months. Better. He's starting to understand that the war's over. That's because you showed him. Tomorrow you get to show a courtroom that his trauma meant something, that what he witnessed mattered. Jake's voice steadied. You've got this. The preliminary hearing took place at Joint Base Andrews in a courtroom that felt too formal for the truth they were there to establish. Morgan arrived early, wearing professional clothes that felt wrong after months of scrubs and field work. Matthews met her outside with Major Carver and the prosecution team, 3 JAG attorneys who looked young and determined and slightly nervous. Defense is going to focus on 2 arguments, the lead prosecutor explained. She was a captain named Ellen Voss, sharp-eyed and precise. First, that behavioral analysis of military working dogs isn't scientifically valid evidence. Second, that you had bias against the defendant based on Torres's ethics complaints, which influenced your interpretation of Axel's behavior. I never met Torres. I didn't know about the complaints until after we identified Petty. We'll establish that in direct examination. But during cross, expect them to twist everything. They'll make it sound like you decided Petty was guilty and found evidence to support that conclusion, rather than following evidence to a suspect. Voss met Morgan's eyes. Stay calm. Answer only what's asked. Don't let them bait you into speculation or emotional responses. Morgan nodded, her mouth dry. The courtroom filled slowly. Military personnel, legal observers, and a handful of handlers who'd known Torres. Petty sat at the defense table looking composed, almost bored, like this was an administrative inconvenience rather than a murder trial. Morgan took the witness stand at 0930, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the truth. Captain Voss walked her through her background first: deployment history, medical training, experience with specialized K-9 units. Then she moved into the Riverside situation, establishing the timeline of events that led to Morgan's evaluation of Axel. Ms. Hayes, when you first observed Axel at Riverside Veterans Medical Center, what did you see? I saw a military working dog displaying behavioral patterns consistent with operational stress, not dangerous aggression. He was maintaining a defensive posture because he was still following his handler's final commands. And how did you determine this? Through observation of his body language, his response patterns, and his reaction to environmental stimuli. His behavior matched what I'd witnessed in specialized K-9 units during my deployment. Dogs trained to operate under protocols that differed from standard military working dog programs. Voss guided her through the demonstration in the kennel, the hand signal that triggered Axel's distress response, and the process of testing his reactions to different personnel. When Petty passed by Axel's enclosure, what did the dog do? He displayed targeted aggression focused specifically on Petty. Not generalized stress or fear, but a directed threat response toward one individual. And in your professional assessment, what did this indicate? That Axel recognized Petty as a threat, that he associated Petty with whatever traumatic event had occurred at the time of Torres's death. Voss entered Morgan's documentation into evidence: behavioral logs, video footage, training protocol analysis. Then she yielded to the defense. Petty's attorney was a lieutenant colonel named Bradford, who looked like he'd been doing this for 20 years and enjoyed breaking witnesses. He approached the stand with a folder and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Ms. Hayes, you testified that you have experience with specialized K-9 units, but you're not a veterinary behaviorist, are you? No. You're not a certified dog trainer? No. In fact, your formal qualifications are in nursing, not animal behavior science, correct? Correct. Bradford flipped through his folder. So when you claim to identify behavioral patterns in military working dogs, you're doing so based on what? Casual observation during your deployment? Based on 2 years of working alongside handlers who use these dogs in operational environments. I learned to recognize threat responses, stress patterns, and communication protocols through direct exposure. Direct exposure, not formal training. The handlers I worked with didn't learn from textbooks either, Colonel. They learned in the field, under conditions where mistakes cost lives. I learned the same way. Bradford's smile tightened. Let's talk about those conditions. You were deployed in Afghanistan from 2019 to 2021. During that time, did you experience any traumatic events? Voss stood. Objection. Relevance. I'm establishing the witness's psychological state, which affects the reliability of her observations. The military judge, a colonel with gray hair and a face that showed nothing, nodded. Overruled. The witness may answer. Morgan kept her voice level. I experienced what any combat medical support personnel experiences. Casualties. High-stress situations. The normal scope of deployment. The normal scope, including treating personnel from classified operations? Yes. Operations you can't discuss publicly? Correct. Bradford moved closer to the stand. Ms. Hayes, isn't it true that you suffer from post-traumatic stress related to your deployment? Objection. Voss was on her feet. Assumes facts not in evidence. Your Honor, the defense has medical records showing Ms. Hayes sought treatment for PTSD symptoms after returning from Afghanistan. Morgan's chest tightened. She'd gone to exactly 3 VA counseling sessions 2 years ago, trying to process nightmares that wouldn't stop. She'd thought those records were confidential. The judge looked at her. Ms. Hayes? I sought counseling for adjustment issues after deployment. That's common among veterans. Bradford pressed. Adjustment issues, including hypervigilance, difficulty trusting authority, and a documented tendency to question official explanations of events. I learned to question explanations that don't match observable evidence. That's called critical thinking, not mental illness. Or perhaps it's a pattern of seeing threats where none exist, interpreting neutral events through a lens of trauma, and projecting your own experiences onto situations you don't fully understand. Bradford's voice hardened. Isn't it possible, Ms. Hayes, that when you looked at Axel, you saw your own unresolved trauma reflected back at you? That your interpretation of his behavior was colored by your own psychological state rather than objective analysis? The courtroom went quiet. Morgan felt the weight of every eye on her, waiting to see if she'd break. No, she said clearly. What I saw in Axel was a trained military asset displaying specific behavioral responses to specific stimuli. My trauma doesn't make me less capable of recognizing his. It makes me more capable, because I understand what combat stress looks like when someone's still fighting a war nobody else can see. Bradford switched tactics. Let's discuss your relationship with the defendant. You knew Torres had filed ethics complaints against Petty, didn't you? Not until after the investigation began. But once you knew, didn't that influence how you interpreted Axel's reactions? Didn't you see what you wanted to see? Evidence against someone Torres had already identified as problematic? I documented Axel's reactions before I knew anything about Torres's complaints. The behavioral patterns were there regardless of what I later learned about the professional relationship between Torres and Petty. Convenient. Bradford's tone dripped skepticism. Ms. Hayes, the prosecution's entire case rests on the premise that a dog's behavior constitutes reliable evidence of human criminal intent. But dogs can't testify. They can't be cross-examined. They can't explain what they experienced or why they reacted the way they did. All we have is your interpretation of behaviors that could have multiple explanations. He paused for effect. Isn't it true that what you're calling threat recognition could just as easily be explained as a traumatized animal reacting to unfamiliar stimuli? That Axel's response to Petty was no different than his response to any stranger in his environment? No. Axel passed by 7 other personnel during evaluations and showed no aggressive response. His reaction to Petty was categorically different, targeted, sustained, and consistent with specific threat recognition rather than generalized anxiety. Or perhaps those 7 other people simply hadn't triggered whatever random association his damaged brain made between strangers and his handler's death. Bradford leaned on the witness stand rail. Ms. Hayes, you can't actually know what Axel was thinking when he saw Petty. Can you? Morgan met his eyes directly. I know what trained behavioral responses look like. I know the difference between trauma and recognition, and I know that dog identified his handler's killer the only way he could, by showing us who he associated with the threat that got Torres killed. Bradford straightened, his expression calculating. No further questions. Voss used her redirect to walk Morgan through the physical evidence that corroborated Axel's identification, the gear logs, the damaged carabiner, the witness testimony, establishing that the dog's behavior hadn't led them down a false path, but toward evidence that independently confirmed the same conclusion. Morgan was dismissed at 11:45. She left the stand feeling scraped hollow, walked out of the courtroom on unsteady legs, and found Matthews waiting in the corridor. "You held up," he said. "Bradford tried to make me look unstable." "He tried to make you look human." Matthews' expression was grim. "But you didn't fold. That matters." The judge ruled 2 days later that Axel's behavioral responses could be admitted as corroborating evidence, not primary proof, but supporting documentation that strengthened the prosecution's physical evidence. Bradford filed an appeal, but it was denied. The full court-martial was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Morgan returned to her contract work, traveling between facilities, but the upcoming trial hung over everything. News had spread through military circles. Handler murdered by jealous colleague, dog identified the killer, nurse with deployment history cracked the case. The story kept growing, picking up details that weren't quite accurate, becoming something bigger than what had actually happened. Morgan hated it. She'd never wanted to be the center of attention. She'd spent years making herself forgettable. Now her name was attached to a case that people across the veteran community were following. Jake called regularly to check in. Patricia sent updates from Riverside. Even Dr. Reeves reached out once, saying she'd been contacted by researchers interested in studying behavioral analysis in military working dogs. Everyone wanted something from the story Morgan had stumbled into. The night before the court-martial began, Morgan sat in another hotel room with Axel sleeping at her feet, reviewing her testimony one more time. Her phone buzzed. Colonel Shaw's number. "Ms. Hayes, how are you holding up?" "Still standing." "Good. I'm calling because there's been a development." Shaw's tone was careful. "During pretrial investigation, military police discovered additional evidence we hadn't found during the initial search. Another handler has come forward claiming Petty approached him months before Torres's death, asking about ways to make equipment failures look accidental. The handler didn't report it at the time because he thought Petty was just venting frustration. But after the arrest, he started wondering if he should have said something. Morgan's grip tightened on the phone. "That's premeditation." That's what prosecution is arguing. They're amending the charges to include conspiracy and planning, which changes the potential sentence significantly. Shaw paused. "But Morgan, this witness is nervous. He's worried about retaliation, about being labeled a snitch, about what speaking up will cost him professionally. Prosecution needs him to testify, but he's considering backing out. Why are you telling me this?" Because you understand what it costs to stand up when it's easier to stay quiet. Because you know what happens when people choose convenience over doing the right thing." Shaw's voice steadied. "The witness's name is Aaron Kelsey. He's at Fort Bragg. Prosecution thinks if you spoke with him, shared your experience with how this investigation unfolded, it might help him understand why his testimony matters." "I'm not a counselor." "No. But you're someone who looked at a situation everyone else had decided was settled and said something's wrong here. That's what Kelsey needs to hear, that speaking up isn't betrayal. It's the only way justice happens." Morgan was quiet for a long moment, watching Axel sleep, thinking about all the moments when she could have stayed quiet and didn't. "Give me his contact information," she said. Shaw sent the details, and Morgan called Kelsey that night. He answered warily. "Ms. Hayes? Mr. Kelsey, Colonel Shaw said you might be willing to talk." "I don't know what good it'll do. What Petty said to me months ago, it could have meant anything. Taking it out of context and using it to bury him feels like I'm twisting his words. Or it feels like you're providing context that makes other evidence make sense." Morgan kept her voice level. "Kelsey, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I will tell you what I learned during this investigation. Silence protects the wrong people. It lets them escape consequences while the people they hurt stay buried. If you have information that clarifies what happened to Torres and you don't share it because it's uncomfortable, you're not staying neutral. You're choosing Petty's comfort over Torres's justice." Kelsey was quiet for a long moment. "Everyone keeps saying Torres was difficult, that he made enemies because he wouldn't compromise. Yeah, that's what people say about anyone who refuses to look the other way when things are wrong." Morgan thought about her own experience at Riverside. Torres filed ethics complaints because he saw something that violated his principles. Petty killed him because those complaints threatened his career. If you stay silent now, you're telling every other handler who sees something wrong that speaking up gets you killed, and nobody will care enough to risk their necks standing up for you afterward. That's harsh. That's reality. Morgan paused. Kelsey, I'm not asking you to fabricate testimony or exaggerate what Petty said. I'm asking you to tell the truth about a conversation you had, even though doing so makes you uncomfortable. There's a difference between making things up and having the courage to admit what you witnessed. Kelsey breathed slowly on the other end of the line. If I testify, people will say I'm only coming forward now because it's convenient, that I should have reported it when it happened. Probably, and they'll be partially right. You should have reported it, but you didn't, and you can't change that. What you can do is choose what happens next. You can let Petty's defense attorneys twist your silence into protection for him, or you can give Torres's family the closure of knowing his murder was deliberate and calculated, not a spur-of-the-moment accident. You make it sound simple. It is simple. It's just not easy. Morgan looked at Axel, still sleeping peacefully, no longer waiting for a handler who would never return. Kelsey, that dog spent 3 months trying to tell people what he witnessed. Nobody understood him until someone finally looked close enough to recognize what he was saying. You have words. Use them. The line went quiet. Then, okay, I'll testify. Morgan hung up and realized her hands were shaking. The court-martial lasted 4 days. Prosecution laid out their case methodically. Physical evidence, witness testimony, gear room logs, and finally Kelsey's statement about Petty's questions months before Torres died. The defense fought hard, challenging every piece of evidence, questioning every witness, but the weight of accumulated proof was overwhelming. On day 3, Morgan testified again, walking the court through her documentation of Axel's behavioral responses. This time Bradford's cross-examination was shorter, more focused, but no less hostile. Ms. Hayes, you've built a career on this case, haven't you? Consultant work, military contracts, recognition you never had before. I've built a career on understanding trauma in veterans and military working dogs. This case was part of that work, not the foundation of it. Convenient timing, though, right when you needed to prove your value after nearly being fired from Riverside. Voss objected. The judge sustained it, but the implication hung in the air. Morgan kept her composure, answered what she was asked, and left the stand feeling like she'd been in combat. On day 4, the defense called its only witness, a veterinary behaviorist who testified that dog behavior was too variable to constitute reliable evidence, that Axel's responses could have multiple interpretations, that using animals as witnesses violated basic principles of due process. Prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They brought in 3 handlers who'd worked with Greylight dogs, all of whom testified that specialized training created consistent, reliable behavioral patterns that experienced observers could interpret accurately. They brought in Major Carver, who walked through the timeline of evidence discovery, establishing that Axel's identification of Petty had been verified by independent physical proof. They brought in the witness who'd seen Petty near the climbing area minutes before Torres arrived. And they brought in photos of Torres's body after the fall, forcing the courtroom to confront exactly what Petty had done. The panel of officers deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, Petty stood at attention while the verdict was read. Guilty on all charges. Premeditated murder. Tampering with equipment. Conduct unbecoming. Conspiracy. Sentencing would come later, but everyone in that courtroom knew Petty was going to military prison for the rest of his operational life. Morgan watched him led away in restraints and felt nothing but tired relief that it was finally over. Matthews found her outside the courthouse afterward. Torres's family wants to meet you. Morgan's stomach dropped. I don't know if that's... They specifically asked, said they want to thank the person who made sure their son's death wasn't forgotten. She followed Matthews to a small conference room where Torres's parents waited, mid-60s, worn down by grief but standing straight. His mother looked at Morgan with red-rimmed eyes. You saved our son's dog, she said quietly, and you made sure the man who killed him faced consequences. I'm sorry for your loss, Morgan said, the words feeling inadequate. Everyone told us it was an accident, that we needed to accept it and move on. Torres's father's voice was rough. But a mother knows. I knew something wasn't right. I just didn't have proof. Your son trained his dog well, Morgan said. Axel tried to tell people what happened. It just took time for someone to understand what he was saying. Torres's mother reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph. Torres in uniform, kneeling beside Axel, both of them looking at the camera with the easy confidence of a team that had worked together so long they moved like one unit. This was taken 3 weeks before he died. He sent it with a letter saying Axel was the best partner he'd ever had. She held it out to Morgan. "I want you to have it, so you remember what you saved." Morgan took the photo with hands that weren't quite steady, and Torres's parents left before she could find better words than the inadequate ones she'd already spoken. She stood alone in the conference room, looking at the image of a handler and his dog, and thought about all the moments when this could have gone differently. When Packard's euthanasia order could have been carried out, when Matthews could have dismissed Axel's behavior as meaningless, when she could have stayed quiet and let the system handle things the way it always did. Torres was still dead. That couldn't be changed. But his killer was in prison. His dog had found peace. And his family knew the truth. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. Morgan left the courthouse with the photograph in her bag and Axel at her side, and behind her, in rooms she'd never see, military investigators were opening files on other suspicious deaths, other convenient accidents, other cases where maybe someone should look closer at what the dogs had been trying to say all along. 3 weeks after the verdict, Morgan stood in a conference room at Fort Bragg, watching Raymond Packard's professional reputation disintegrate in real time. The Inspector General's final report had been released that morning, 47 pages documenting systemic failures at Riverside Veterans Medical Center, with Packard's decisions regarding Axel featured prominently in Section 3. The findings were clinical and devastating: inadequate evaluation protocols, premature euthanasia determination, failure to consult appropriate specialists, and deliberate dismissal of staff concerns that contradicted administrative preferences. Morgan wasn't supposed to be at this briefing. She was there consulting on an unrelated case, but word had spread fast, and Colonel Shaw had invited her to observe the disciplinary proceedings via video conference. On screen, Packard sat at a table facing a panel of senior administrators and Veteran Services oversight officials. He looked smaller than Morgan remembered. Tired. His expensive suit didn't carry the same authority it once had. The lead investigator, a woman with steel gray hair and a voice that cut like precision instruments, walked through the findings methodically. "Mr. Packard, your decision to proceed with euthanasia, despite objections from medical staff, demonstrated a pattern of prioritizing institutional convenience over proper evaluation standards. Your subsequent attempt to terminate Ms. Hayes for challenging that decision further demonstrates a culture of retaliation against employees who raised legitimate concerns." Packard started to respond, but the investigator continued. "More troubling is the evidence that you falsified portions of the behavioral assessment documentation to support your predetermined conclusion. The incident report submitted to justify euthanasia contained statements attributed to staff members who later testified they never made those observations." Morgan's chest tightened. She'd suspected the reports were incomplete. She hadn't realized they'd been deliberately altered. Shaw, standing beside her watching the screen, spoke quietly. He was covering his tracks, making sure if questions were asked later, the paperwork would support his version. "He was burying evidence," Morgan said. "Yes." On screen, Packard's attorney tried to argue that the falsifications were administrative errors, not intentional misconduct. The panel wasn't buying it. The lead investigator delivered the conclusion. "Mr. Packard, effective immediately, you are suspended without pay from your position as Operations Director at Riverside Veterans Medical Center. You will face additional hearings regarding potential criminal charges related to falsification of federal documents. Your security clearances are revoked, and you are barred from holding any position within Veteran Services Administration pending the outcome of those proceedings." Packard's face went white. This is accountability for actions that nearly resulted in the death of a decorated military asset and the obstruction of a murder investigation. The investigator's tone didn't change. "You will surrender your facility credentials within 24 hours. This hearing is concluded." The screen went dark. Shaw turned to Morgan. "How do you feel?" Morgan thought about it. "I don't feel satisfied. I feel like this should never have required an Inspector General investigation in the first place. Like basic competence and human decency should have prevented everything that happened." "You're not wrong." Shaw pulled up something on his tablet. "But because of what you did, new protocols are being implemented across all VA facilities. Mandatory consultation periods for euthanasia decisions, third-party review processes, whistleblower protections for staff who challenge administrative decisions, Packard's failure is creating systemic change. That doesn't bring Torres back. No. But it might save the next person whose dog is carrying evidence nobody knows how to read. Shaw handed her the tablet. Which brings me to why I asked you here. We have another case. Different facility, different circumstances, but similar pattern. Military working dog displaying behavioral responses that local staff are interpreting as dangerous aggression. They're moving toward euthanasia. Morgan looked at the file. Belgian Malinois named Valor. Handler killed in training accident 4 months ago. Multiple incident reports. Scheduled termination in 10 days. They haven't learned anything, she said quietly. Some have, some haven't. That's why we need you. Shaw met her eyes. Morgan, you proved that someone outside traditional channels can see things the system misses. We want to formalize that. Create a dedicated position for evaluating military working dogs flagged for euthanasia. Someone with authority to override local decisions if specialized training or trauma responses are being misidentified. You want me to be the person who says no when facilities like Riverside make mistakes. I want you to be this person who ensures those mistakes don't happen in the first place. Shaw pulled up another document. Full-time position, GS-13 equivalent civilian grade, based wherever you want to live with travel as needed. Complete operational independence. Direct reporting to Special Operations Command, which means you bypass local administrators entirely. You'd essentially be the last line of defense between institutional convenience and preventable injustice. Morgan stared at the job description, feeling the weight of what Shaw was offering. It was everything she'd needed when she first walked into that kennel at Riverside. It was the authority to do what was right instead of begging permission from people who'd already decided what they wanted the answer to be. When do I start? She asked. Shaw smiled. Yesterday would be preferable, but I'll settle for next week. Morgan returned to Riverside one final time to collect the last of her belongings and close out her consultant status. The facility felt different, not physically but in atmosphere. Staff members moved with more purpose. The rehabilitation wing had new protocols posted on every wall. And in the administrative office where Packard used to reign, an interim director was already implementing changes. Patricia found Morgan in the break room. Heard about Packard. Can't say I'm surprised, but I didn't think it would come down that hard. He falsified federal documents to justify killing a military asset. The hardness was appropriate. Patricia poured coffee, studying Morgan's face. You're different than when you started here. More direct. Less worried about making people uncomfortable. I got tired of being someone people could ignore. Yeah, I noticed. Patricia smiled slightly. For what it's worth, you changed this place. The new protocols, the review processes, the requirement that we actually listen to staff concerns, that's all because you refused to back down. Even when it would have been easier. It should never have been hard. Morgan's voice carried an edge. Doing the right thing should be the default, not the exception that requires courage. Agreed, but we don't live in that world yet. So people like you, people who push back when systems fail, matter more than you probably realize. Patricia set down her cup. What's next for you? Morgan told her about the new position, about Valor and the facility in Texas where history was repeating because nobody had learned the lessons Torres' death should have taught them. Patricia listened, then said something Morgan wasn't expecting. You know what the real difference is between you and Packard? He saw complications as problems to eliminate. You see them as information to understand. That's why you'll be good at this job. You don't need easy answers. You need true ones. Jake walked Morgan to her car afterward, carrying the box of personal items she'd accumulated over months of contract work. Heard you're taking the special ops position, he said. News travels. It's a military community. News travels at the speed of gossip. Jake set the box in her trunk. You gonna be okay, traveling constantly, dealing with worst-case scenarios, fighting institutions that don't want to be challenged? Probably not, but I'll be useful. Jake laughed. That's the most honest answer I've heard all week. His expression turned serious. Morgan, what you did here, saving Axel, exposing what happened to Torres, holding Packard accountable, that mattered. Not just for this facility, for everyone who works in veteran care and wonders if speaking up is worth the cost. You showed us it is. I showed you it's possible. Whether it's worth it depends on what happens next. Morgan closed the trunk. Jake, Riverside is implementing new protocols because they got caught. The real test is whether they maintain those changes when nobody's watching. That's on you and Patricia and everyone else who stays. Don't let them slide back. We won't. Jake extended his hand. Take care of yourself out there. Morgan shook his hand, got in her car, and drove away from Riverside for the last time, Axel sleeping peacefully in the passenger seat. The facility in Texas was called Lone Star Veterans Recovery Center, and when Morgan arrived 3 days later, she found a situation that was depressingly familiar. Military working dog displaying aggression. Local staff convinced he was dangerous. Euthanasia scheduled. Administration resistant to outside interference. The facility director was a man named Gerald Hoskins, late 50s, military background, with the kind of rigid certainty that came from decades of following procedures without questioning whether those procedures were correct. He met Morgan in his office with obvious irritation. Ms. Hayes, I understand you've been sent by Special Operations Command, but I assure you our evaluation of valor was thorough. The dog is a liability we cannot safely maintain. Morgan had heard this speech before. Show me the incident reports. Hoskins handed over a file. Morgan read through it, recognizing patterns she'd seen at Riverside. Incomplete documentation. Conclusions that jumped from observation to determination without adequate analysis. No consideration of specialized training factors. When was Valor's handler killed? Morgan asked. 4 months ago. Training accident during explosive detection exercises. Has anyone evaluated whether Valor's aggression might be trauma responses related to that incident? We have a veterinary behaviorist on staff who reviewed the case. Did that behaviorist have experience with military working dogs trained in specialized detection protocols? Hoskins' expression tightened. Ms. Hayes, I don't appreciate the implication that our staff is incompetent. I'm not implying incompetence. I'm stating that specialized training requires specialized evaluation. If your staff doesn't have experience with the specific protocols Valor was trained under, their assessment is incomplete. Morgan set down the file. I need access to Valor's service records, his handler's training documentation, and 24 hours to conduct my own evaluation before any euthanasia proceeds. The decision has already been made. The decision can be unmade if new information warrants it. Morgan's voice was level but firm. Mr. Hoskins, I'm not here to undermine your authority. I'm here to ensure we don't make irreversible mistakes based on incomplete analysis. If Valor is genuinely dangerous, my evaluation will confirm that. But if he's displaying trauma responses that are being misidentified, we need to know before we kill him. Hoskins stared at her, clearly wrestling with whether to dig in or cooperate. You have 24 hours. But Ms. Hayes, if your evaluation disrupts facility operations or puts staff at risk, I will file a formal complaint with Special Operations Command. Noted. Morgan spent that afternoon reviewing Valor's records and found exactly what she expected. Sophisticated training in explosive detection, specialized command protocols, and a handler who'd customize standard procedures to optimize performance in high-threat environments. Valor wasn't a standard military working dog. He was a precision instrument trained to operate in situations where mistakes meant casualties. And 4 months ago, his handler had died in an explosion that the accident report described as equipment malfunction. Morgan's instincts started firing. She requested access to the handler's incident file and discovered something the local staff hadn't noticed. The explosive detection equipment that malfunctioned had been serviced the day before by a contractor who wasn't part of the regular maintenance team. The service was documented, but nobody had followed up on who authorized it or why non-standard personnel were used. Morgan called Shaw. I think we have another problem. She explained what she'd found. Shaw was quiet for a long moment. You're suggesting the handler's death wasn't accidental. I'm suggesting nobody looked closely enough to rule it out, and Valor's behavioral responses might tell us whether we need to. Proceed with your evaluation. I'll have investigators pull the full incident file. Morgan entered Valor's enclosure the next morning with the same careful approach she'd used with Axel. The Malinois watched her with wary intensity, not moving from his position in the back corner. She spoke to him in normal tones first, establishing baseline behavior. Then she shifted into the specialized cadence she'd learned from handlers in Afghanistan, testing whether Valor responded to those patterns. He did, immediately and precisely. Morgan spent hours working through command sequences, documenting which protocols Valor recognized and which ones triggered stress responses. And when she used a specific hand signal associated with explosive threat assessment, Valor's reaction told her everything she needed to know. The dog's entire posture shifted into alert mode. Not aggressive, not fearful, mission-focused. He was waiting for the next command in a sequence his handler had initiated 4 months ago and never completed, because his handler had died before he could finish giving orders. Morgan documented everything, then called Shaw with her findings. Valor isn't dangerous. He's still operational. His handler signaled an explosive threat right before the accident, and Valor's been waiting for follow-up commands ever since. Everything the staff here interpreted as aggression was actually the dog trying to maintain security protocols because nobody told him to stand down. Shaw's voice was tight. We're pulling the incident investigation. If the handler detected a threat before the explosion, then the equipment malfunction might not have been an accident. Morgan looked at Valor, who watched her with those same alert, focused eyes. Shaw, how many other handlers have died in training accidents over the past 2 years? The silence on the other end of the line was answer enough. I'll send you the list, Shaw said finally. Morgan, if what you're suggesting is true, if someone's targeting handlers and their dogs are carrying evidence, this is bigger than Torres. This is systematic. Then we need to start listening to what the dogs are trying to tell us. The investigation exploded from there. Military Criminal Investigation Command opened files on 7 handler deaths classified as training accidents over the past 18 months. Morgan was brought in to evaluate the surviving dogs from 3 of those incidents, animals flagged as dangerous and scheduled for euthanasia. In every case, she found the same pattern. Dogs displaying behavioral responses consistent with operational trauma. Dogs trying to complete mission protocols their handlers had initiated before dying. Dogs carrying information nobody had bothered to extract because the people evaluating them didn't understand the language they were speaking. The findings led investigators to a contractor company that serviced equipment at multiple training facilities, the same company that had worked on the detection gear that killed Valor's handler, the same company whose employee had approached Petty months before Torres died, asking questions about equipment vulnerabilities. The conspiracy was broader and deeper than anyone had suspected, and it had been hiding in plain sight because the primary witnesses were dogs, and dogs couldn't testify. Except they could. They just needed someone who knew how to translate. 6 months after the Petty verdict, Morgan stood in front of a congressional oversight committee presenting findings that would reshape how military working dogs were evaluated across all service branches. The committee chair, a senator with 3 decades in veteran affairs, leaned forward. Ms. Hayes, you're recommending that all military working dogs flagged for behavioral issues undergo mandatory evaluation by specialists trained in trauma recognition and specialized protocol analysis before any euthanasia decisions are made. Yes, Senator, and I'm recommending those evaluations be conducted by personnel with operational deployment experience, not just academic veterinary training. The dogs we're discussing aren't pets with behavior problems. They're highly trained assets operating under protocols most people don't know exist. Evaluating them requires understanding combat trauma, specialized communication systems, and mission-specific conditioning. That's a significant change to current procedures. Current procedures have resulted in the euthanization of dogs carrying evidence of criminal activity, including murder. They've allowed systematic failures to continue undetected because nobody was listening to what the animals were trying to communicate. Morgan kept her voice level. Senator, these dogs serve alongside our soldiers. They save lives. They complete missions that humans can't. And when their handlers die, they deserve better than being classified as problems to eliminate. They deserve someone who will take the time to understand what they've survived and what they're trying to tell us. The senator looked at his colleagues, then back at Morgan. Your recommendations will be included in the final report. Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Hayes. Morgan left Capitol Hill feeling like she'd fought a battle nobody else could see, but knowing that somewhere, dogs who would have been killed were going to get second chances because someone had finally proven their behavior meant something. Axel was waiting in her hotel room, sprawled across the bed like he owned it. He looked up when she entered, tail moving in lazy acknowledgement. We did it, Morgan said quietly, sitting beside him. They're listening now. The dog rested his head on her leg, eyes closing, finally completely at peace. Morgan's phone rang. Shaw's number. Saw the committee testimony on C-SPAN, he said. Well done. They're actually going to implement the changes? They'd be idiots not to. You just handed them away to prevent future scandals and improve veteran care. Politicians love that combination. Shaw paused. Morgan, there's something else. We found the last piece of the contractor investigation. The person who coordinated the equipment sabotages wasn't just targeting handlers randomly. He was specifically going after people who'd filed ethics complaints or reported problems with his company's work. Torres, Valor's handler, 3 others, they all had one thing in common. They saw something wrong and reported it. Morgan's chest tightened. They were killed for speaking up. Yes. And their dogs became collateral damage because nobody understood what they'd witnessed. Shaw's voice was heavy. But because of you, we caught it. The contractor's under arrest, his company's being prosecuted, and we're implementing safeguards to prevent this from happening again. None of that occurs without your work. It shouldn't have required my work. It should have been obvious. But it wasn't, because the system was designed by people who never considered that dogs might have something important to say. Shaw paused. Morgan, you didn't just save individual animals. You changed how we think about military working dogs as witnesses, as trauma survivors, as intelligence assets. That's legacy work. Morgan ended the call and sat in the quiet hotel room, processing everything that had happened since she'd walked into that kennel at Riverside and decided she couldn't stay silent. She thought about Torres, about his parents' faces when they thanked her for finding truth in their son's death, about Valor and the other dogs who'd been hours from euthanasia when she arrived, about Packard, whose career had imploded because he'd prioritized convenience over conscience, about Petty, spending decades in military prison for a murder he thought would never be discovered. And she thought about all the people who'd told her to stay quiet, to not make waves, to accept that some battles weren't worth fighting. They'd been wrong. The work continued. Morgan traveled between facilities, evaluating dogs, challenging decisions, teaching staff how to recognize what they'd been missing. Some administrators welcomed her. Others resented the oversight. She didn't particularly care either way. Her job wasn't to be liked. It was to be right. 1 year after the Petty verdict, Morgan received an invitation to Fort Benning for a ceremony honoring Torres posthumously. She almost didn't go. Public recognition still made her uncomfortable, but Shaw convinced her it mattered. The ceremony was held outdoors on a crisp October morning. Military personnel, handlers, and families gathered to witness the dedication of a new K-9 training facility named after Torres. His parents were there, standing with quiet dignity as a general spoke about their son's service and sacrifice. After the speeches, Torres's mother approached Morgan. He would have liked knowing his dog helped catch his killer. Axel's a remarkable animal. Torres trained him well. Liam trained all his dogs well. But more than that, he taught them to think, to assess situations and respond intelligently instead of just following commands blindly. She smiled slightly. He used to say the best handlers didn't control their dogs. They partnered with them. That's what made his work so effective. Morgan thought about that word. Partnership. That's what she'd offered Axel when everyone else saw only a problem to eliminate. That's what had allowed the dog to finally communicate what he'd been trying to say for months. Your son was right, Morgan said, and he deserved better than what happened to him. He got justice, though, eventually, because of you. Torres's mother touched her arm. That matters more than you probably realize. To his family. To the other handlers who knew something was wrong but couldn't prove it. To everyone who serves, knowing that if something happens to them, someone will care enough to find the truth. She walked away, leaving Morgan standing in autumn sunshine watching handlers work with their dogs. And for the first time since this entire situation began, she felt like maybe the cost had been worth it. That evening, Morgan sat in her apartment with Axel sleeping nearby, reviewing files for her next case. Another facility. Another dog flagged for euthanasia. Another situation where nobody had bothered to ask the right questions. Her phone buzzed. Jake's name appeared. Saw the ceremony on the Army's website, he said. How'd it go? Heavy, but good. Morgan set down the file. How's Riverside? Still implementing changes. Patricia got promoted to assistant director. New guy in charge is actually listening to staff concerns instead of dismissing them. It's weird having competent leadership. Jake paused. Morgan, we got a case last week that made me think of you. Veteran came in with a service dog showing aggression issues. Local shelter wanted to take the animal, said it was dangerous, but something felt off about their assessment. What did you do? I used the protocols you taught us, did proper behavioral observation, recognized trauma responses instead of just cataloging incidents. Turns out the dog wasn't aggressive. He was protecting his owner from a situation nobody else had identified as threatening. The owner was being abused by a family member, and the dog was trying to defend him. Morgan's chest tightened. Did you help them? We got the veteran into protective services and kept the dog with him. They're both in a safer situation now. Jake's voice carried something that sounded like pride. None of that happens if you hadn't shown us how to look past surface behavior and understand what's actually happening. You changed how we work, Morgan, how we think about the animals in our care. That's what should have been happening all along. Maybe, but it wasn't. Until you made it impossible for us to keep doing things the wrong way. Jake paused. I know you don't like recognition, but I need you to understand that what you did here, what you're still doing, matters to more people than just the ones you directly save. Every staff member who learns to evaluate properly. Every facility that implements better protocols. Every dog that gets a fair assessment instead of a premature death sentence. That's all because you refused to accept that the system was good enough. Morgan didn't know what to say to that. Anyway, Jake continued, I just wanted you to know, in case you ever wonder if this work is worth the cost. He hung up, and Morgan sat in the quiet apartment thinking about ripples spreading outward from decisions made in desperate moments. About how one nurse who wouldn't stay silent had changed how an entire system operated. About how many dogs and handlers would benefit from protocols that existed only because she'd challenged people who thought they had all the answers. It wouldn't bring Torres back, wouldn't undo the trauma Axel had carried for months, wouldn't erase the fear she'd felt walking into that enclosure at Riverside, not knowing if she was right or catastrophically wrong. But it meant something. 3 months later, Morgan was invited to speak at the National Military Working Dog Conference, an annual gathering of handlers, trainers, veterinarians, and program administrators. She almost declined. Public speaking still felt wrong, like she was claiming authority she didn't think she deserved. Shaw talked her into it. Morgan, these people need to hear from someone who fought the system and won, someone who proved that questioning authority isn't insubordination when authority is wrong. The conference was held in San Antonio. Morgan stood backstage listening to the keynote speaker, a decorated handler discussing the bond between soldiers and their dogs, and felt completely out of place. Then they called her name. She walked onto the stage facing an audience of 300 people who worked with military dogs professionally. People with credentials and experience and decades of expertise. People who probably knew more about canine behavior than she ever would. But Morgan had something they didn't. She'd looked at a situation everyone else had given up on and refused to accept the convenient answer. I'm not a veterinary behaviorist, she started. I'm not a certified trainer. I don't have formal qualifications in animal behavior science. What I have is deployment experience, medical trauma training, and a stubborn refusal to let paperwork override observable reality. She told them about Axel, about Torres, about the moment she'd walked into that kennel and recognized what everyone else had misidentified as danger. The system failed that dog, Morgan said. It failed his handler. It failed everyone who trusted that proper protocols would protect military assets from being discarded because they were inconvenient. And it would have kept failing if someone hadn't been willing to challenge decisions that looked official but were fundamentally wrong. She talked about the investigation, about Valor and the other dogs, about the conspiracy that had hidden in plain sight because nobody thought to listen to what the animals were communicating. We train these dogs to be intelligent, adaptive, mission-focused assets. We teach them to assess threats, recognize patterns, and respond to situations with precision most humans can't match. Then when their handlers die and they display complex behavioral responses to trauma, we treat them like malfunctioning equipment instead of witnesses carrying information we don't know how to access. Morgan looked out at the audience. I'm here to tell you that we can do better. We must do better. These dogs serve with courage and loyalty that most humans will never match. When they come home broken, scared, or angry, they deserve someone who'll take time to understand what they've survived instead of deciding it's easier to eliminate the problem. She finished by describing the new protocols being implemented: mandatory trauma evaluation, specialized assessment requirements, whistleblower protections for staff who challenged administrative decisions. None of this fixes what happened to Torres, Morgan said. But it might prevent the next handler from dying unnoticed, the next dog from being killed while carrying evidence, the next facility from choosing convenience over doing what's right. And if that happens, if even one dog gets a fair evaluation instead of a premature death sentence, then maybe the cost was worth it. The applause started before she'd even left the stage. Afterward, handlers approached her wanting to discuss cases at their facilities. Trainers asked about specialized protocol recognition. Veterinarians requested copies of her evaluation methodology. And a young woman in Army uniform thanked her for showing that challenging authority wasn't career suicide when you were fighting for something that mattered. Shaw found Morgan at the reception that evening. "You looked uncomfortable up there." "I was terrified. Didn't show. You looked like someone who knows exactly what she's talking about and doesn't care whether people like hearing it." Shaw handed her a drink. "Morgan, 3 facilities have contacted me since your speech requesting your evaluation services. 2 congressional staffers asked for copies of your testimony. And the Department of Defense is forming a task force on military working dog trauma protocols. They want you on it." Morgan took the drink. "I just wanted to save 1 dog." "You did, and then you saved a dozen more. And now you're changing how the entire military thinks about these animals." Shaw's expression was serious. "That's not nothing, Morgan. That's legacy work. The kind of thing that matters long after you're done doing it." Morgan thought about Torres's photograph, still in her bag after all these months. Thought about Axel sleeping peacefully at home instead of dead in a kennel. Thought about all the dogs who would get second chances because protocols had changed. "It shouldn't have required a fight," she said quietly. "It should have been obvious that killing military assets without proper evaluation was wrong. But it wasn't obvious. Not until you made it impossible to ignore." Shaw raised his glass. To the nurse who wouldn't stay quiet. Morgan didn't drink to that, but she didn't argue either. 6 months later, the Department of Defense officially adopted new standards for military working dog evaluation, incorporating trauma assessment requirements and specialized protocol analysis into every behavioral review. Facilities across all service branches implemented mandatory consultation periods before euthanasia decisions. And a national database was established to track dogs flagged for behavioral issues, ensuring patterns of misidentification could be caught before they resulted in preventable deaths. The changes were named the Torres Protocol, in memory of the handler whose dog had started everything. Morgan continued her work, traveling between facilities, evaluating dogs, teaching staff, and challenging decisions that looked convenient but felt wrong. She didn't always win. Some dogs she couldn't save. Some cases she couldn't solve. Some administrators she couldn't convince. But she kept trying anyway, because that's what people did when they understood that silence protected the wrong things. When they recognized that comfort was expensive if it cost someone else their justice. When they refused to accept that systems were good enough just because changing them required courage. On the anniversary of Axel's adoption, Morgan took him back to Riverside for a visit. The facility had changed significantly. New leadership, better protocols, staff trained to recognize trauma instead of just cataloging incidents. Patricia showed her around, pointing out improvements that had been implemented over the past 18 months. "You should be proud," Patricia said. "This place is unrecognizable compared to what it was when you arrived." Morgan looked at the rehabilitation wing, at veterans working with therapy dogs under proper supervision, at staff members who actually listened when animals displayed distress. "I'm not proud of what it took to make these changes necessary," she said, "but I'm glad they're happening." They walked past the administrative wing where Packard used to work. A new nameplate hung on the director's door. Through the window, Morgan could see someone meeting with staff, actually listening instead of dictating. Heard Packard's charges were reduced to administrative violations, Patricia said. He took a plea deal, lost his license to work in veteran services but avoided prison. That's more grace than he showed Axel. Agreed. But Morgan, the fact that he faced consequences at all, that's because you didn't back down. 5 years ago, he would have fired you, killed the dog, and nobody would have questioned it. The system's not perfect yet, but it's better than it was, and that matters. Morgan left Riverside that afternoon feeling like maybe Patricia was right. The system wasn't fixed, but it was different, and different was the first step toward better. She drove home through Thornfield thinking about everything that had happened since that desperate night when she'd broken protocol to evaluate a dog everyone had written off. About the cost of speaking up when systems demanded silence. About the weight of carrying truth nobody wanted to hear. About whether it had been worth it. Axel slept peacefully in the passenger seat, no longer waiting for someone who would never return, no longer trapped in the mission that had consumed him for months. He'd found peace not because someone had fixed him, but because someone had finally understood what he'd been trying to say. Morgan's phone buzzed. Unknown number. She pulled over before answering. Hayes. Ms. Hayes? This is Captain Linda Ortega, Naval Special Operations. I'm calling about a military working dog situation at our facility in San Diego. We have an animal flagged for euthanasia, but some of the staff are questioning whether the behavioral assessment was adequate. Your name came up as someone who specializes in cases like this. Morgan felt that familiar pull. Another facility, another dog, another situation where someone needed to question whether the easy answer was the right one. Tell me about the dog, she said. As Ortega described the situation, Morgan realized she was already planning the evaluation, already thinking about what protocols to test, already preparing to fight for an animal nobody else thought deserved saving. Because that's who she was now. Not the invisible nurse people overlooked, not the veteran trying to forget what she'd survived, but the woman who'd looked at an impossible situation and refused to accept that it couldn't be solved. The woman who'd proven that sometimes the only thing standing between justice and catastrophe was someone willing to say no when everyone else was saying yes. The woman who understood that real strength wasn't about being fearless. It was about being terrified and doing what needed to be done anyway. Morgan Hayes had spent years making herself forgettable. Now she was the person facilities called when they needed someone who remembered that convenient answers and correct answers weren't always the same thing. She'd saved one dog. Then she'd exposed a murder. Then she'd changed how the entire military evaluated trauma in working animals. Not because she was exceptional, but because she'd refused to be silent when silence would have been easier. I can be in San Diego by tomorrow afternoon, Morgan said. Don't make any final decisions until I've had a chance to evaluate the animal myself. Understood. Thank you, Ms. Hayes. Morgan hung up and looked at Axel, who'd woken during the conversation and was watching her with calm, trusting eyes. Ready for another fight? She asked quietly. The dog's tail moved once. Steady, certain. Morgan pulled back onto the road, driving toward whatever came next, carrying with her the knowledge that she'd become exactly what the world needed her to be. Not perfect. Not fearless, but relentlessly unwilling to let injustice hide behind paperwork and administrative convenience. They'd called her insignificant once, told her to stay in her lane, dismissed her concerns as interference from someone who didn't understand how things worked. They'd been wrong, and now, because one nurse had refused to stay quiet, dogs across the country were getting second chances. Handlers were being remembered instead of forgotten. And the people who thought they could hide crimes behind convenient accidents were learning that witnesses came in unexpected forms. Morgan drove into the sunset with a dog who'd survived everything beside her, and behind them both, a system that would never be quite the same, because someone had finally proven that the underestimated could change everything when they stopped accepting the world as it was and started fighting for what it should be. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. Not that Morgan Hayes was special, but that anyone could be, if they chose courage over comfort when it mattered most.